You stand at the window of a small cabin, your hands resting on the rough-hewn sill, the wood still holding the faint warmth of the day that has just slipped away beyond the prairie horizon. The glass before you, if you are fortunate enough to have glass, shows your reflection dimly, a ghost layered over the deepening blue of evening. If there is no glass, only oiled paper or a wooden shutter you have not yet closed, the air that touches your face carries the first whisper of the cold that will arrive in full before morning. You are a woman on the frontier, and the night is coming. Behind you, in the single room that serves as kitchen, parlor, and sleeping quarters, 3 children move through the rituals of evening. The youngest, not yet 4, crouches near the stove, pushing a wooden horse across the floorboards, his breath forming small sounds of invented adventure. The middle child, a girl of 7, sits on a low stool, her thin legs folded beneath her skirt, working to untangle a knot in the lace of her boot. The eldest, a boy of 9, stands near the table, his hands busy with the task you have given him, checking the seams of the quilts, looking for places where the stitching has begun to fail, where the cold might find a way in. The stove radiates heat in a sphere that does not quite reach the corners of the room. You know this without measuring, the way you know the weight of a bucket by the pull in your shoulder, the way you know the hour by the quality of the light. The cabin is 16 feet by 14, the dimensions of the life you have built here, the dimensions of the warmth you must create and sustain against the vast indifference of the winter prairie. You turn from the window and move back into the room, your skirt brushing the edge of the table, your hand reaching without thought for the kettle on the stove. The water inside has been heated and cooled and heated again throughout the day, a reservoir of warmth that serves a dozen purposes. You pour a measure into the basin and carry it to the corner where the children will wash before bed, the steam rising between your hands, a small cloud that dissipates into the cooler air of the room. This is the hour when you become an architect of warmth, an engineer of survival, though you would never use such words. You think only of what must be done, the sequence of tasks that will carry your children safely through the night. You think of your own mother, and her mother before her, and the unbroken chain of women who have stood in rooms like this one, in cabins and cottages and sod houses, in log structures chinked with mud and grass, in dugouts carved into hillsides, all of them turning toward the same essential work as darkness falls. The children come to the basin one by one. You wash their faces and hands, the water still warm enough to bring color to their cheeks, and you dry them with a length of rough cotton that hangs on a nail beside the stove. The youngest leans against your leg as you work, his weight slight but steady, his trust absolute. You run your fingers through his hair, feeling for dampness, finding none. Dampness is an enemy here, moisture that will steal heat from the body, that will turn cloth into a conductor of cold rather than a barrier against it. You guide them toward the corner of the room where the bed stands, a frame of pine logs laced with rope, the ropes tightened and retightened as the seasons shift and the humidity changes and the fibers relax. On top of the rope lattice lies a mattress stuffed with prairie grass and corn husks, materials that crackle softly when weight shifts across them, materials that hold air and therefore hold warmth. You have sewn the mattress cover yourself, double-stitched the seams, checked it for tears that might let the filling escape or allow the sharp ends of the husks to work their way through and prick tender skin. Before the children climb into the bed, you perform the small ceremonies that will keep them warm through the night. You have been preparing for this since mid-afternoon, since the sun began its westward slide and you began to think ahead to this moment. The bricks that spent the day near the stove, absorbing its heat, are now wrapped in squares of thick flannel. You have 4 such bricks, salvaged from the chimney of a failed homestead 3 miles to the east, carried back one at a time in a sack over the course of a month. They are dense and reddish-brown, porous enough to hold heat but solid enough to retain it for hours. You place one at the foot of the bed, tucked beneath the quilts where the children's feet will rest. Another you position near the center, where it will radiate warmth into the core of the sleeping space. The remaining 2 you keep wrapped and resting on the stove, insurance against the deepest cold of the hours before dawn. The children watch you with eyes that are beginning to grow heavy. They know this routine, have known it since they were old enough to remember. The girl climbs in first, moving to the side nearest the wall, her brother following, and finally the youngest, who nestles between them. You arrange them with the care of someone solving a puzzle, the smallest child in the middle where he will be warmest, the older two creating windbreaks with their bodies, their combined heat a shared resource. Now come the layers. First, the sheet, thin and worn soft by countless washings, a layer of cotton that lies directly against their skin and will absorb the moisture of their breath and the slight perspiration of their sleep. Over this, a blanket of wool, traded for butter and eggs at the store in town, a blanket that still smells faintly of the sheep it came from, of lanolin and grass and the particular clean scent of animal warmth. The wool is thick enough to trap air, loose enough to let moisture escape, miraculous in its ability to insulate even when damp. Above the wool blanket, you spread the first of the quilts. This one is made of squares pieced from old dresses and shirts, fabrics that once moved through daily life and now serve this new purpose. You recognize a patch of blue calico from a dress your mother sewed for you when you were 12, a corner of brown cotton from your husband's work shirt, a triangle of white muslin from the christening gown that all three children wore in turn. The quilt is not beautiful in the way that some quilts are beautiful, not a planned pattern of colors and shapes, but a document of necessity, of fabric saved and repurposed, of warmth built from the remnants of other things. The second quilt is heavier, filled with wool batting that you carded yourself during the long evenings of last winter, your hands moving through the rhythm of the work while your mind moved through other places, other times. This quilt takes longer to warm beneath, but once warm it holds the heat like a promise, like a commitment made between the fabric and the bodies beneath it. The third quilt, the outermost layer, is filled with feathers. Not the fine down of geese, which you have heard about but never seen, but the smaller feathers of prairie chickens and ducks, collected over 2 years, washed and dried and stored in a flour sack until you had enough to fill a quilt. The children call this one the cloud quilt, because it is lighter than the others despite its warmth, because it seems to float above them, settling gently over the landscape of their bodies. You tuck the edges of the quilts beneath the mattress, creating a seal against drafts, a continuous envelope of warmth. You pull the quilts up high, almost to the children's chins, leaving their faces exposed to the air of the room. This is important. You learned this from your mother, who learned it from hers. Faces must breathe the free air, must not be buried beneath covers, no matter how cold the night. There are stories of children who burrowed too deep, who breathed their own breath again and again until it became something else, something dangerous. You do not think of these stories often, but they live in your hands as you arrange the covers, in the precise distance you maintain between quilt edge and chin. The smallest child's eyes are already closed. The girl is fighting sleep, wanting to stay in this moment a little longer, in the warmth and safety of this preparation. The boy looks at you with a question in his eyes, and you know what he is asking without words. You cross to the shelf and take down the bed curtain, a length of heavy fabric that you hung from hooks in the ceiling beam above the bed. The curtain is made from a blanket that grew too worn for other use, its edges bound with strips of hide to keep it from fraying. When you pull it closed around the bed, it creates a smaller room within the room, a space that will hold the children's warmth and keep it circulating around them, that will block the drafts that creep along the floor and down from the ceiling, that will create a den, a cave, a pocket of survivable air in the larger cold of the night. Before you close the curtain completely, you lean in and kiss each child, your lips touching foreheads that are already warm, already safe. The girl reaches up and touches your face, her small hand cool against your cheek, and you smile at her in the dimness. You tell them good night, your voice low and steady, and you hear their murmured responses, words already blurred by the softness of approaching sleep. You draw the curtain closed and stand for a moment, listening. You hear the rustle of the corn husks in the mattress as someone shifts position. You hear the smallest child's breathing, already deepening into the rhythm of sleep. You hear the wind beginning to move outside, a sound like a conversation carried on in a language you almost understand. If you have enjoyed this journey into the quiet strength of frontier women, please subscribe to receive more stories like this one, narratives that will settle into your evening, that will accompany you into rest, that will let you grow wiser and calmer as you drift into deep sleep. These are stories built for the threshold between waking and dreaming, built to be companions in the peaceful dark. You turn back to the stove and feed it 2 more pieces of wood, adjusting the damper to slow the burn, to make the fuel last through the night. The wood is cottonwood, fast burning and giving more smoke than you would like, but it is what you have. In the fall, your husband cut and stacked 3 cords, and you calculated that it would last until spring if you were careful, if you burned only what was necessary, if you combined the heat of the stove with all the other strategies you know for keeping warmth alive in a cold place. The cabin itself is a fortress of small defenses against the winter night. The walls are chinked with a mixture of clay and grass, applied and reapplied as it cracks and falls away. The floor is earth, packed hard as stone, covered in the center of the room with a rag rug braided from strips of worn cloth. The ceiling is low, barely 6 feet high, and this is intentional, this is wise, because heat rises and a low ceiling keeps the warm air closer to the bodies that need it. Around the base of the walls, on the inside, you have banked earth and sod, creating a berm that insulates the lower portion of the cabin, that stops the wind from finding its way through gaps between the logs and the floor. This banking will stay in place until spring, and in spring you will shovel it back outside, and the cycle will continue, the cabin breathing with the seasons, adapting to the demands of the weather. The door is thick, made from planks your husband shaped with an adze, hung on hinges traded for a side of bacon. You have stuffed the gaps around its frame with strips of cloth, and you have hung a blanket on the inside, a curtain that covers the door and adds another layer of protection. The window, the single window with its precious pane of glass, has a wooden shutter on the outside that your husband closes each night before he goes to the barn to check on the livestock. Tonight he is not here, he has gone to town, a journey of a day and a half, to purchase supplies and to sell the furs he trapped during the early winter, and so you have closed the shutter yourself, standing on a stool to reach the latch, your hands stiff with cold by the time you came back inside. You are alone with the children tonight, and this is not unusual, and it does not frighten you. You have been alone with them before, many times. You know what to do. You know the sequence of tasks, the careful architecture of safety that you build new each night. You move to the table and sit down, pulling your sewing basket toward you. By the light of a single candle, you work on a small shirt for the youngest child, letting out the seams to give him another season of wear. Your needle moves in and out of the fabric, the thread whispering through the weave, and your mind moves in and out of thoughts, settling on nothing, allowing the quietness of the work to fill you. The wind outside is stronger now. You hear it testing the corners of the cabin, sliding along the walls, looking for weaknesses. The cabin creaks softly, the logs settling, the roof beams adjusting to the pressure of the air moving above them. These are familiar sounds, the language of the structure that holds you, and you are not troubled by them. In the bed behind the curtain, the children sleep. You do not need to look to know this. You can hear it in the quality of the silence, in the absence of small movements, in the slow deep breathing that barely reaches you across the room. They are warm. You have made them warm. Tomorrow they will wake with pink cheeks and bright eyes, and they will throw back the quilts and gasp at the shock of the colder air, and they will come to you and press their warm bodies against yours, and the cycle will begin again. But that is tomorrow. Tonight, you sit with your sewing, the candle burning beside you, the stove ticking softly as the metal expands and contracts, and you are content. This is your work. This is your art. Not the quilts themselves, though they are beautiful in their way, not the cabin, though it is strong and well made, but this, the keeping alive of small bodies through the cold and unforgiving night, the creation of warmth where there is no warmth, the building of safety in a place that offers none freely. You are a woman on the frontier, and you know how to keep children warm. Your mother taught you some of this. The rest you have learned by trial, by observation, by necessity. You learned by watching what worked and what did not work, by remembering the mistakes that brought cold and the choices that brought warmth. You learned by listening to other women, in the rare times when you saw them, when a neighbor stopped by on her way to somewhere else, when you met at the creek to wash clothes, when you gathered for a barn raising or a wedding or a funeral. In those moments, women talked. They shared what they knew. They spoke of the bricks heated in the stove, of the curtains around beds, of the way to arrange children so that their bodies would warm each other, of the signs that meant a child was too cold, the signs that meant danger. You learned that cold is not simply the absence of warmth but an active presence, a force that moves and searches and finds its way into places you would not expect. You learned that cold settles in low places, pools on floors, drains life from the extremities first. You learned that cold is patient, that it will wait for you to grow tired, to grow careless, to forget one of the small protections that together make the difference between safety and catastrophe. And you learned that warmth is not a single thing but a combination of many things, a structure built from layers of cloth and heated bricks and carefully directed air, from the heat of the stove and the heat of bodies and the heat that is somehow generated by the sense of safety itself, by the knowledge that someone is watching, someone is tending, someone is awake and aware and prepared to act if action becomes necessary. You learned that children are remarkably resilient and also remarkably fragile, that they can survive conditions that seem impossible and yet can be harmed by things that seem insignificant. You learned to watch them constantly, to read the signs in their skin and their breathing and their energy, to know when they are truly warm and when they are only temporarily comfortable, when they are safe and when they are in the early stages of cold that, if not interrupted, will progress into something more serious. The candle burns lower. You finish the seam you are working on and set the shirt aside. You stand and move to the stove, opening the door to check the fire. The wood has burned down to coals, glowing red and orange, pulsing slightly as if breathing. You add one piece of fresh wood, a small piece that will burn slowly, that will keep the coals alive without creating too much heat, without wasting fuel. You close the door and adjust the damper, your hands moving with the certainty of long practice. You cross to the bed and part the curtain slightly, just enough to look inside. The children are visible in the faint light that comes from the stove, 3 mounds beneath the quilts, 3 heads on the pillow made from a flour sack stuffed with feathers and grass. Their faces are peaceful. Their breathing is slow and even. You reach in and touch the quilts, feeling the warmth that is held there, the pocket of warm air that they have created and that the quilts are holding in place. You adjust the top quilt slightly, pulling it a little higher on the smallest child's shoulder, and then you close the curtain and step back. This checking will happen several times before morning. You will wake in the night, or perhaps you will not truly sleep, and you will rise from your own bed, a narrow cot near the stove, and you will come to this place and part the curtain and look and listen and touch, confirming that the warmth is still there, that the children are still safe. If the fire has burned too low, you will build it up. If the bricks have cooled, you will replace them with the ones that have been staying warm on the stove. If a child has kicked off the covers, you will rearrange them. This is the vigil you keep, the watch you stand, every night of the winter, every winter of your children's lives. You blow out the candle and make your way to your cot in the darkness. The room is not entirely dark, the stove gives a faint glow through the seams around its door, and the banked coals inside create a presence that is felt more than seen. You lie down and pull your own quilts over you, fewer than the children have but sufficient for your needs. You are accustomed to sleeping lightly, to waking at small sounds, to being always partially aware of the state of the room, the state of the fire, the state of the children. Outside, the wind continues. Inside, the warmth holds. You close your eyes and allow yourself to rest, knowing that you will wake when needed, knowing that the night will pass as nights pass, and that morning will come, and that you will do this again tomorrow, and the tomorrow after that, and all the tomorrows that winter contains. This is how pioneer women kept children warm on frontier nights. Not through any single grand gesture, not through heroic action or dramatic sacrifice, but through the steady accumulation of small acts, small wisdoms, small preparations that together created a barrier between the vulnerable bodies of children and the indifferent cold of the prairie winter. Through knowledge passed down and knowledge earned, through vigilance and care and the willingness to place the children's warmth ahead of their own comfort, through the transformation of simple materials, bricks and fabric and dried grass, into instruments of survival. You lie in the darkness and you do not think of yourself as heroic. You think only that this is what must be done, and so you do it. You think that your mother did this for you, and her mother did this for her, and that your daughter, when she is grown, will do this for her own children, and that this unbroken chain of care is perhaps the truest thing you know, the most reliable fact in a life that contains very few certainties. The wind finds a gap somewhere in the cabin's defenses and a small draft moves across the floor, cold as water, but it does not reach the bed where the children sleep. You have seen to that. You have built the walls of warmth high enough and thick enough to keep them safe. And so the night deepens, and the cold settles over the prairie, and inside the small cabin, the children sleep on, warm and unaware of the care that surrounds them, the invisible architecture of love and knowledge that holds them safe until morning. You stand at the threshold of understanding now, your mind settling into the rhythm of this world where warmth was not a given but an achievement, where every degree of heat represented intention and labor. The cabin around you exists in that delicate equilibrium between inside and outside, between the cold that wants to claim everything and the small sphere of warmth that human hands have carved from the indifferent night. You have already felt the weight of responsibility that came with frontier motherhood, that knowledge that children's survival depended entirely on what you knew, what you remembered, what you could fashion from almost nothing. The women who kept children warm in those long winters understood something fundamental about heat itself, about the way it moved and fled, about the surfaces that held it and the gaps that released it. They understood it not through scientific language but through the education of consequences, through nights when they had done too little and mornings when they found frost on the inside walls, through experiments that could not afford to fail because the stakes were measured in fingers and toes, in the rattling coughs that could become pneumonia, in the pallor of a child's face that meant the cold had pressed too close. You learned first about the cabin itself, about how the structure determined everything that would follow. The log walls around you, if you were fortunate enough to have them, were not the seamless barriers they might appear. Each log settled differently as the wood aged and dried, creating gaps that widened with the seasons, fissures through which winter could insert its thin fingers. The work of chinking these gaps occupied the autumn months, a task that fell largely to women and older children. You would gather clay from the creek bed when the water ran low, mixing it with dried grass, horsehair if you had it, sometimes ashes from the fireplace that gave the mixture both body and a quality that resisted moisture. The chinking went on for days, sometimes weeks. You would work from the inside first, pressing the mixture deep into every visible crack, smoothing it with hands that grew raw from the clay's alkaline bite. Then you circled to the outside, filling again, creating a double seal. The children helped with this, even the smallest ones, their hands better suited to the narrow gaps near the roofline. You taught them to feel for the draft, to hold their palms near the wall and sense the movement of air that betrayed an opening. This was education of a particular kind, training them to perceive what could not be seen, to read the invisible language of heat and cold that governed their survival. But chinking was never perfect. The cabin breathed despite your best efforts. You learned to live with this, to understand that absolute seal was impossible and perhaps not even desirable, because a cabin sealed too tight could suffocate its inhabitants or fill with smoke if the chimney drew poorly. So you learned instead to manage the drafts, to understand their patterns and mitigate their effects. You hung blankets over the worst spots, those corners where the chinking inevitably failed or where the logs themselves had cracked along their length. Heavy quilts, often the oldest and most worn ones that no longer served well enough for beds, became wall coverings, their bulk creating dead air spaces that insulated better than the logs alone. The floor beneath your feet presented its own challenge. Many frontier cabins had dirt floors in the early years, packed earth that conducted cold upward like a stone. You combated this with layers, with everything you could place between bare feet and frozen ground. First came a bed of straw or dried grass, renewed each autumn, spread thickly across the entire floor space. Over this, if you were prosperous or industrious enough, went braided rag rugs, those endless spirals of fabric strips that represented hundreds of hours of work during evening lamplight. Every worn dress, every shirt beyond mending, every scrap of cloth too small for other use went into these rugs, braided tight and sewn into ovals or rectangles that covered the main pathways and the areas where children played. The making of these rugs occupied winter evenings, your hands working automatically while your mind wandered or while you listened to your husband read from the Bible or one of the few books you owned. The children learned to braid as soon as their fingers could manage it, sitting near the fire with their own strips of cloth, creating smaller lengths that you would later incorporate into the larger work. Nothing was wasted. Even the braiding itself became a lesson in economy, in transformation, in the way that fragments could be woven into something useful and enduring. Some families who stayed longer in one place eventually laid puncheon floors, logs split lengthwise and smoothed on one side, fitted together as tightly as skill allowed. These were warmer than bare earth, and they elevated the living space above the immediate cold of the ground. But they brought their own problems, gaps between the puncheons where dirt and cold air could rise, splinters that found children's feet, and the endless battle against the dirt that sifted up through the cracks. You swept these floors daily, sometimes twice daily, and still the dust rose, mixing with the smoke from the fireplace, settling on every surface with a gritty persistence. The windows, those precious sources of light, betrayed you when winter came. Glass was expensive and fragile, often brought across great distances at considerable cost. Many frontier families made do with oiled paper or scraped hide stretched across window openings, translucent enough to admit some light but offering almost no insulation. You learned to cover these windows at night with whatever would hold back the cold, wooden shutters if your husband had time to make them, blankets pinned or nailed over the opening if he had not. The morning ritual included uncovering these windows, letting in the winter light, and the evening ritual covered them again, sealing away the dark and the cold together. If you did have glass windows, you saw ice form on their inner surface during the hardest cold, frost flowers blooming in intricate patterns that the children found beautiful and you found troubling, because you knew they meant heat was escaping and cold was penetrating to the very middle of your home. You hung heavy curtains, made from wool if you could get it, from canvas or layered cotton if you could not. These curtains stayed closed through most of the winter day, opened only briefly to assess the weather or to give the children a glimpse of the snow-covered world beyond their warm enclosure. The single fireplace or stove formed the heart of your heating strategy, the sun around which all other efforts orbited. If your cabin had a fireplace, you learned to manage it with the skill of an artisan, understanding that simply piling on wood created waste rather than warmth. The efficient fire burned in layers, with larger logs at the back creating a wall of coals, smaller wood in front burning hot and steady, and the careful management of airflow that came from adjusting how you stacked the wood and where you allowed air to enter. You rose before the children every winter morning, often before first light, to resurrect the fire from the coals you had carefully banked the night before. This banking was crucial, a skill that meant the difference between morning fire and morning misery. Before sleep, you would rake the best coals together, cover them with ash to slow their burning, and often place a large log at the back that would smolder through the night. In the morning, you cleared the ash gently, added small kindling, and breathed life back into the sleeping embers. The children knew to stay in bed until you had the fire going, until the worst cold had retreated from the cabin center. For families fortunate enough to have a cast iron stove, the dynamics changed but the attention required did not diminish. These stoves, whether the simpler box stoves or the more elaborate models with multiple cooking surfaces, radiated heat more efficiently than an open fireplace. They could be damped down to burn slowly through the night, and they offered more control over heat output. But they required constant feeding, constant adjustment of the dampers and flues, and they created their own hazards. The metal surfaces grew hot enough to brand flesh instantly, and you taught your children from their earliest walking days to respect the stove's perimeter, to never touch it, to always remain aware of its presence. Around this central heat source, you orchestrated a careful geography of warmth. The children's sleeping area occupied the warmest zone, as close to the fire as safety permitted. During the coldest nights, you might bring their beds or pallets even closer, arranging them in a semicircle that faced the stove or fireplace. The parents' bed often stood farther away, because adult bodies generated more heat and withstood cold better than children's. This was understood, unquestioned. The warmest spots belonged to the most vulnerable. But even this central heat reached only so far, creating what you might think of as zones of habitability. Near the fire, warmth enough for bare hands and uncovered heads. 5 feet away, the cold began to assert itself, requiring shawls and wrapped blankets. At the cabin's edges, Near the walls and especially near the door, the cold ruled almost completely, barely held at bay by the distant fire. You learned to store food in these cold zones, to use your cabin's temperature gradient as a primitive refrigeration, keeping milk and meat cool without letting them freeze solid. Water management became another constant winter task, another element in the complex system of keeping children warm and alive. The well or creek might be 100 yards from your door, and fetching water in sub-zero temperatures tested endurance and determination. You carried what you could in the morning, filling every available vessel, because you did not want to make that journey more often than necessary. The children watched you pour water into the large pot that sat perpetually near the fire, keeping it warm for washing, for cooking, for the 100 small needs that arose through the day. This pot of warm water served purposes beyond the practical. It released moisture into the cabin's dry air, moisture that made breathing easier and kept skin from cracking painfully. It created a sense of abundance in a season of scarcity, the visible presence of water that had not frozen, that remained yielding and useful. The children could dip a cloth into it to wash their faces without the shock of ice-cold water, could rinse their hands without the numbing pain that came from breaking ice in a basin. You heated stones in the fire, smooth river rocks that held warmth for hours, and these became mobile sources of heat that could be deployed strategically. Wrapped in cloth to protect against burns, these hot stones went into the children's beds before sleep, nestled near their feet where cold struck first and hardest. The stones cooled slowly through the night, giving up their heat by degrees, and in the morning you returned them to the fire to heat again. Some mothers kept a rotation going, one set of stones heating while another set warmed small bodies, a continuous cycle that lasted the winter through. Soap stones, those slabs of soft stone that could be carved and smoothed, were particularly prized for this purpose because they held heat longer than ordinary rocks and distributed it more evenly. If you had one, you guarded it carefully, heating it in the fire's edge where the heat was strong but not so intense as to crack the stone. The largest of these soap stones could keep a bed warm for half the night, and children slept with their feet pressed against them, drawing comfort not just from the heat but from the solid, reliable presence of something warm in the cold darkness. Clothing, too, became part of the architecture of warmth, layers upon layers that created insulating air spaces and trapped body heat close to the skin. The children dressed in the morning in a sequence you had perfected through experience. First the union suit of knitted wool or flannel that covered them from neck to ankles, then woolen stockings pulled high, then a dress or shirt and trousers, then often another layer, a pinafore or vest, and finally for the coldest days a shawl or small blanket pinned around the shoulders. These clothes stayed on through the day and often into the night. The notion of changing into special sleeping clothes was a luxury for warmer seasons or wealthier families. In winter, you simply removed the outer layers, leaving the union suits and stockings in place, adding perhaps a flannel nightgown over everything if you had one to spare. The children slept dressed against the cold, ready to rise into the morning chill without the vulnerable moment of nakedness that could set them shivering and unable to warm again. You made these clothes yourself, or traded for them, or received them from family back east if you were fortunate enough to maintain those connections. The sewing occupied 3 seasons of the year, cutting and stitching so that winter would find everyone adequately clothed. You measured children against their clothes from the previous year, assessed what could be let out and what must be made new, and you planned accordingly. Wool was precious, each piece of woolen fabric representing either substantial cost or the even more substantial work of raising sheep, shearing them, processing the wool, spinning it, and weaving it. Nothing woolen was ever thrown away while any use remained in it. When a woolen garment grew too small or too worn for its intended purpose, it became something else. Dresses became shirts, shirts became infant gowns were cut down for diapers or used as patches on newer garments. The final destiny of most wool was the rag rug or the quilt batting, torn into strips or pulled apart into fluff that could still insulate, still serve, still justify its existence. You taught your daughters this economy, this chain of use, teaching them to see not what something was but what it could become. The bedding itself represented perhaps the most important element in keeping children warm through frontier nights. The bed frames, if you had them, stood high off the floor to escape the worst of the cold that pooled at ground level. Under the mattress, whether it was stuffed with corn husks, straw, or the relative luxury of feathers, you might place a layer of newspapers or old cloth, anything that added another barrier between sleeping bodies and the cold air beneath. The mattress itself you made and remade as materials allowed, emptying out the old filling in spring, washing the ticking, and refilling it with fresh materials in autumn. Over this mattress went sheets if you had them, and over the sheets began the layers of covering that would see the children through to morning. First a light blanket or quilt, then heavier blankets, then the thickest quilts, then often another blanket on top of everything. This pile of coverings grew heavy, its weight pressing down with a force that might seem oppressive in other seasons but in winter felt like security, like protection. The children nested under these layers, body heat trapped in the small space they occupied, the weight of the blankets preventing the warm air from escaping. You made these quilts through the summer and fall, piecing together scraps of fabric in patterns that were both beautiful and functional. The patterns had names you knew by heart: log cabin, nine patch, bear's paw, drunkard's path, and each one represented a different strategy for joining small pieces into a useful whole. The quilting itself, the stitching that bound the top fabric to the batting and backing, you often did communally at quilting bees where neighboring women gathered to accomplish together what would take one woman weeks alone. But beyond the social pleasure, the quilting served the practical purpose of creating small pockets of air throughout the quilt structure, pockets that trapped heat and prevented the batting from shifting and bunching. The closer together your stitches, the more of these tiny air pockets you created, and the warmer the finished quilt. You learned the ideal density through experience, through nights when a loosely quilted covering failed to hold heat adequately and nights when a tightly quilted masterpiece kept children warm even when the fire burned low. The sleeping arrangements themselves reflected the need to share warmth. Children slept together whenever possible, 2 or 3 to a bed, their bodies creating a shared pool of heat that kept all of them warmer than they could have been alone. You arranged them strategically, placing a warmer-blooded child next to one who tended to feel the cold more keenly, putting the youngest in the middle where they benefited from warmth on both sides. The children accepted this crowding without complaint, understanding instinctively what you knew explicitly, that together they survived what separately they might not. On the very coldest nights, the nights when you could see your breath inside the cabin despite the fire burning steadily, you sometimes brought the youngest children into your own bed, creating a family nest where everyone's warmth contributed to everyone else's survival. These nights had a particular quality, a sense of the family drawing together against the elements, of physical closeness substituting for the heat you could not otherwise provide. The children burrowed between you and your husband, small warm bodies that barely moved once sleep took them, and you lay awake longer than you should have, listening to their breathing, feeling the rise and fall of their small chests, grateful for another night when the cold stayed outside where it belonged. In the morning, you woke to a cabin transformed by the night's cold. Frost painted the windows, ice filmed the water bucket, the fire had burned down to embers that gave almost no heat. You rose into this cold, wrapping a quilt around your shoulders, and began again the daily work of creating warmth, of pushing back the cold, of making the cabin habitable for the small lives that depended on your knowledge and your effort. The children stayed under their covers until you called them, until the fire blazed again and the worst edge of morning cold had retreated. They emerged gradually, reluctantly, their hair tousled and their faces soft with sleep, and you fed them warm food and kept them close to the fire while they woke fully into another winter day. This rhythm repeated itself through weeks and months, the daily and nightly cycle of warming and cooling, of creating safety and maintaining it. You grew tired, bone-tired, the kind of tired that came not from a single hard day but from the accumulation of many hard days with no relief in sight. But you continued because continuation was the only option, because children did not raise themselves and cold did not respect exhaustion. Other frontier mothers lived this same reality in cabins scattered across the vast landscape, each of you solving the same problems with whatever materials and knowledge you possessed, each of you succeeding most nights and failing occasionally, learning from those failures, adapting, surviving. You think now about the knowledge these women carried, the things they understood about survival that had nothing to do with sentiment or philosophy and everything to do with the practical physics of staying alive. They understood heat transfer and air circulation without knowing those terms. They understood the relationship between moisture, temperature, and human comfort without benefit of scientific instruments. They understood childhood vulnerability and the narrow margins that separated safety from danger. This understanding lived in their hands and their habits, in the automatic actions they performed hundreds of times each winter, in the constant low-level vigilance that kept them aware of temperature, of fire condition, of children's comfort even while they attended to other tasks. The cabin around you settles into evening now, the light fading outside the small windows, the temperature beginning its nightly drop. The fire needs tending again, the eternal cycle continuing, and you move toward it with the smooth competence of someone who has performed this action countless times before, someone who knows exactly how much wood to add, where to place it, how to adjust the airflow to create the overnight burn that will keep the worst cold at bay. The children are fed, they are warm, they are safe for another night, and that is enough. That has to be enough, because it is all that any frontier mother could hope to achieve, and achieving it required everything she had to give. You wake before the true dawn, the time when darkness feels most complete and the cold presses closest to the skin. Your daughter's breathing is soft beside you, and you feel the weight of her small body beneath the layers you've arranged through the night. The fire has burned low again, as fires always do in these hours, and you know without looking that the red glow has diminished to a scatter of embers that pulse like distant stars when the wind finds its way through the chinks in the logs. You don't rise immediately. Instead, you lie still and feel the architecture of warmth you've constructed, the heated stones wrapped in cloth near her feet, the quilts layered heaviest where her core rests, the way your own body has curved to block the draft that seeps from the window frame. This is knowledge that lives in your muscles now, in the automatic adjustments you make without waking fully, the way you've learned to monitor temperature through sleep itself. The cabin exhales around you, its logs contracting in the cold, producing those small reports and groans that once startled you but now form part of the night's familiar vocabulary. You can hear your neighbor's cow in the shed beyond the east wall, shifting in her stall, her large body another source of warmth that you've learned to appreciate in ways you never imagined back in Pennsylvania. The animal heat that radiates through the shared wall makes a difference of several degrees in that corner of the cabin, and you've positioned the children's bed to benefit from this living furnace. Your son is in the loft above, where he insisted on sleeping once he turned 9, claiming the space as his territory the way boys do when they begin to imagine themselves as men. You worried about the cold up there, where heat rises but doesn't linger, where the roof peak gathers frost on the inside of the shingles during the deepest freezes. But he stuffed every gap with dried grass and old fabric, and he sleeps in his clothes beneath a buffalo robe your husband traded for last autumn, and when you climb the ladder to check on him, as you do every night, though you pretend you don't, you find him warm enough, his cheeks flushed in sleep, his breath clouding white in the dim light. These are the calculations you make constantly, the mathematics of survival that have nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with attention. You've learned to read cold the way you once read books, discerning its qualities and intentions, understanding that not all cold is the same. There is the dry cold that comes down from Canada, brittle and sharp, that freezes wash water almost before it settles in the basin. There is the damp cold that rolls up from the creek bottom, insidious and penetrating, that finds its way through wool and linsey-woolsey and seems to settle in the bones themselves. There is the wind-driven cold that batters the walls and seeks every flaw in your construction, every gap you haven't discovered yet, every place where your attention has lapsed. Against all these varieties of cold, you deploy an equally varied arsenal of warmth. The fire, yes, always the fire, but the fire is only the beginning, the foundation upon which everything else is built. The fire must be fed precisely, too much wood and it burns hot and fast, consuming your carefully gathered fuel and leaving you depleted before morning, too little and it dies to ash while you sleep, and you wake to a cabin so cold that the water bucket has ice an inch thick on its surface. So you've learned to bank the fire, a term you heard from an older woman at the settlement meeting last autumn, a woman who'd survived 30 winters on the frontier and whose children had all lived, which was testimony enough to make you listen carefully to everything she said. Banking a fire means building it in layers, placing the largest logs at the bottom where they'll burn slowly through the night, covering them with ash and dirt to slow the combustion, leaving just enough air to keep the wood converting to heat without converting to flame. It's an art, like so much else out here, something you have to learn through practice and failure, something no book could have taught you. You remember the first winter, when you didn't know about banking fires, when you simply piled wood onto the flames before sleep and hoped it would last until morning. You remember waking to smoke so thick you couldn't see across the cabin, the children coughing, your husband stumbling to open the door and let the acrid cloud escape into the night, all of you shivering in the sudden inrush of frigid air while the fire roared uselessly, wasting fuel and warmth in equal measure. You remember the second winter, when you burned the fire too low, too cautious after that first mistake, and you woke to find the baby's lips tinged blue, and the panic that seized you then still lives somewhere in your chest, a cold stone that presses against your breathing when you check on the children in the night. But now, this third winter, you've found the balance. The fire burns low and steady through the dark hours, and the cabin maintains a temperature that won't keep anyone comfortable by the standards you once knew, but that prevents the dangerous cold from taking hold. The children sleep through the night without waking, which is itself a kind of miracle, a sign that their bodies aren't fighting the temperature, that the warmth you've arranged around them is sufficient for their small furnaces to maintain their heat without burning through all their resources. You ease yourself from beneath the quilts, moving slowly so as not to disturb your daughter, and you reach for the shawl you keep within arm's reach of the bed. The air in the cabin is cold enough that you can see your breath, but not so cold that the water bucket has frozen, which means the fire has done its work. You pad across the floor in your stockings, feeling the difference in temperature as you move from the area near the bed, where body heat has accumulated, to the center of the cabin, where the cold pools, to the hearth, where the banked coals still radiated gentle warmth. You kneel before the fire and begin the process of waking it, uncovering the coals carefully, blowing gently to encourage them, feeding small kindling until flames appear, then slightly larger pieces until the fire catches and begins to rebuild itself. This is another skill you've acquired, this ability to resurrect a fire from its sleeping state, to coax it back to life without smothering it with too much fuel or too much attention. Your hands move through the familiar motions while your mind ranges further, thinking about the day ahead, the tasks that will fill the hours between now and the next nightfall, when you'll begin again the careful work of keeping everyone warm through the darkness. The water bucket hasn't frozen, but the water is numbingly cold, and you're grateful for the kettle you hung on the crane last night before bed, positioned just far enough from the coals to prevent boiling but close enough to stay liquid. The water in it is lukewarm now, tepid enough for washing without making you gasp. You pour some into the basin and wet a cloth and press it to your face, feeling the day begin, feeling yourself become present and purposeful in a way that sleep doesn't require. Your husband will wake soon, when the light begins to gray the darkness, and he'll dress quickly and go out to check the animals, breaking ice in their water, forking hay from the stack, ensuring that they've survived the night as the children have. The animals are part of this same equation, this mathematics of warmth that governs everything. A cow can die from cold if she's wet, if the wind reaches her, if she lies down in snow and can't rise. A chicken can freeze to death on her roost, her feet locked onto the perch, her body stiff and light as a bundle of feathers. You've learned to care about these creatures not just for what they provide, milk and eggs and eventually meat, but for their survival itself, which feels connected to your own survival in ways you're still learning to understand. The horse your husband rides to check the traplines wears a blanket at night now, an old quilt you sacrificed from your household stores because the animal's warmth is more important than human comfort. A frozen horse means your husband travels on foot, means he can't check the distant traps, means you might lose a week's worth of pelts to other trappers or to scavengers, means the whole fragile economy of your survival tilts toward insufficiency. So the horse wears the quilt, and you and your husband share one less layer, and this is simply how things are now, how decisions get made on the frontier. You hear your daughter stirring behind you, the small sounds of a child emerging from sleep, and you turn from the fire to see her sitting up in bed, her hair tangled from the night, her eyes still soft with dreams. She doesn't complain about the cold, though you know she feels it. She's learned, as children learn, to accept the conditions of her life as normal, as simply how things are. She doesn't remember the house in Pennsylvania with its many rooms and its large stove and the way warmth was something you took for granted, like air itself. This cabin, this cold, these careful arrangements of quilts and stones and fire, this is all she really knows now, and watching her accept it with such matter-of-fact resilience breaks your heart and fills you with pride in equal measure. You tell her to stay in bed while the cabin warms, and she obeys, burrowing back under the quilts but remaining propped on one elbow, watching you move around the room preparing breakfast. You slice cornmeal mush from yesterday's batch and set it in the spider to fry, and you measure coffee beans into the grinder, and you move through these morning rituals with the same careful attention you bring to everything now, because nothing out here is automatic, nothing can be done carelessly without consequence. The boy climbs down from the loft, his movements loud in the quiet morning, all elbows and growing limbs, and he goes immediately to stand by the fire, holding his hands toward the flames. His breath clouds white in the air, but he doesn't complain either. He's learned, perhaps even more than his sister, to bear discomfort without comment. There's a stoicism that the frontier seems to breed in people, a kind of silent endurance that becomes habitual, that becomes part of your character. You worry sometimes that your children are learning to expect too little from life, that they're becoming hardened in ways that might make it difficult for them to ever live differently, to ever return to places where comfort is available and expecting it isn't considered weakness. But then you remember that survival itself is a skill, that resilience is a virtue, that your children are learning to be strong in ways that matter, and you tell yourself that this hardship is temporary, that you're building something here that will eventually provide ease and security. You tell yourself this, though you're less certain than you were 2 years ago, less sure that the frontier is a temporary condition rather than a permanent state of being. Your husband emerges from the lean-to where he slept. He often sleeps there when he comes in late from checking traps, not wanting to disturb the household, and you've made it as comfortable as possible with straw, ticking and wool blankets, though it's colder than the cabin proper, exposed on 3 sides to the elements. He looks tired, his face creased from sleep, his eyes still adjusting to wakefulness, but he nods at you and at the children and goes to the basin to splash his face, gasping slightly at the cold water. You serve breakfast without ceremony, the fried mush, dark with molasses, chicory coffee cut with roasted grain, the last of the preserves from autumn spread thin on yesterday's bread. It's not much by the standards you once knew, but it's sufficient, and the children eat without complaint, fueling themselves for the day ahead. Your son will help his father with the outside work, learning the skills he'll need to survive on his own someday, though you hate to think of him leaving, hate to imagine him setting off into this vast and difficult landscape to establish his own homestead. Your daughter will stay with you, learning the indoor work, the endless tasks of cooking and cleaning and mending and preparing that keep a household functioning. But before the work begins, before everyone scatters to their duties, you allow yourself this moment of stillness, this brief pocket of time when everyone is together in the warming cabin, eating and warming themselves, safe and alive and present. These moments feel precious in ways you couldn't have anticipated, feel like the real wealth you're accumulating out here, more valuable than land or livestock or anything else you might acquire. After breakfast, after your husband and son have dressed in their outdoor layers and gone out into the brightening morning, you turn your attention to the ongoing work of preparation, the constant looking ahead that frontier life requires. Tonight's warmth must be arranged throughout the day, in small increments, through tasks that seem unrelated to warmth but that contribute to it nonetheless. You take the stones from last night's warming, they're cold now, their heat long since given to the bed, and you place them in the ashes at the edge of the fire, where they'll heat slowly throughout the morning. By afternoon they'll be too hot to touch with bare skin, and by evening they'll be perfect, radiating steady warmth but not dangerous, ready to be wrapped and tucked into the bed before the children climb beneath the quilts. You've collected these stones carefully over time, choosing flat, smooth river rocks that hold heat well and don't crack when heated and cooled repeatedly. You lost several stones in the first winter, rocks that exploded in the fire or split in half when you poured water near them, and you learned to test new stones carefully, heating them slowly at first, learning which ones could be trusted. While the stones heat, you turn to the quilts, examining them in the daylight for wear and damage. The quilts are perhaps your most important tool against the cold, more valuable even than the fire, because they hold the warmth that bodies generate, multiplying it through layers and trapping it close to the skin. You've brought 3 quilts from Pennsylvania, wedding gifts and heirlooms sewn by grandmothers and aunts, and you've made 2 more since arriving here, piecing them together from scraps and worn-out clothes and any fabric you could spare from other purposes. Each quilt represents hours of work, hundreds of small stitches holding batting between patterned pieces, creating not just warmth but beauty, small islands of color and design in a landscape that often feels uniformly gray and brown. You run your hands over the quilts now, feeling for thin spots, checking the binding for frays, making note of repairs that need to be made. One quilt has developed a tear along a seam where the stitching has given way, and you fetch your sewing basket and settle into the rocking chair near the window, where the morning light is strongest. The work is meditative, the needle moving in and out of the fabric, the thread pulling through with a soft whisper, closing the gap stitch by small stitch. Your mind wanders as your hands work, thinking about the women who made this quilt, your husband's grandmother who pieced the top, your own mother who helped quilt it, binding it with tiny even stitches that have held for years but are finally beginning to fail. You think about how those women are gone now, how they died in their beds in Pennsylvania, in houses with plastered walls and glass windows and stoves that kept every room warm, how they never knew you would end up out here, using their handiwork to keep their great-grandchildren alive in a log cabin on the frontier. You wonder what they would think if they could see you now, whether they would approve of the choices you've made, whether they would understand the compromises and calculations that fill your days. You think they might understand better than you sometimes imagine, that women have always been doing this work, keeping children alive through cold nights, whether in Pennsylvania or Ohio or here on the Kansas prairie, whether with quilts or coal or whatever materials came to hand. The specific circumstances change, but the fundamental task remains the same: create warmth where there is cold, create safety where there is danger, create life where there are forces that would diminish it. By midday the cabin has warmed considerably, the fire drawing well, the weak winter sun adding its small contribution through the oiled paper that covers the window opening. You finished mending the quilt and returned it to the bed, layering it with the others in the configuration you found works best, the heaviest quilts on top, where their weight helps trap warm air, the lighter ones beneath, creating insulating layers that multiply the body's heat. You've learned that more thin layers work better than fewer thick ones, that air trapped between layers is itself an insulator, that the arrangement matters as much as the total amount of covering. Your daughter works beside you through the morning, learning by watching and doing, absorbing the skills she'll need when she has her own household to manage. You show her how to test the stones for proper warmth, holding your hand just above the surface to feel the heat radiating upward, judging by experience whether they need more time or are ready to wrap. You show her how to fold the cloth around each stone, tucking the ends securely so they won't come loose in the night and expose hot rock to skin. You show her where to place them in the bed, near the feet primarily, where cold settles first, but also one near the middle where small bodies can curl around it. She asks questions as she works, her child's curiosity leading her to wonder about things you've stopped questioning. Why do we heat stones instead of using bottles of hot water like Grandma did? Because we don't have bottles that could withstand repeated heating, and because stones hold heat longer, releasing it slowly through the night rather than cooling quickly like water. Why do we sleep together instead of each person having their own bed? Because shared body heat is efficient, because it reduces the number of areas you need to keep warm, because 3 people under one set of quilts stay warmer than 3 people under 3 separate sets. Her questions remind you that this knowledge you've acquired isn't natural or inevitable, that it's specific to this place and time, that it represents solutions to problems that many people never face. In some other life, your daughter would never need to know how to heat stones for bed warming or how to layer quilts for maximum insulation or how to judge whether a cabin is warm enough for safe sleep. But in this life, the life you're actually living, these skills might save her someday, might save her children, and so you teach her carefully, patiently, making sure she understands not just the how but the why. In the afternoon you bake bread, timing it so the oven's heat will contribute to warming the cabin in the evening hours, when the temperature begins to drop again. The oven is a simple affair, a cast iron box that sits at the edge of the fireplace, and baking in it requires constant attention, rotating the bread to prevent burning, adjusting the coals to maintain even heat. But the effort is worthwhile not just for the bread itself but for the warmth the baking generates, heat that would otherwise escape up the chimney but that instead radiates into the cabin, warming the air, warming the walls, warming everything in its sphere. You've learned to time your cooking carefully, doing the heaviest baking and boiling in the evening rather than midday, so the heat serves double purpose. In summer this would be backwards, you'd cook in the morning before the heat became oppressive, but in winter every activity must be evaluated for its contribution to warmth. Washing clothes becomes a winter luxury because heating that much water takes enormous fuel, so you wait for relatively warmer days, days when you can afford to open the door and let the steam escape without losing too much heat. Your husband and son return as the light begins to fade, their faces red from the cold, their outer layers dusted with frost from their breath. They've spent the day repairing a section of the shed roof that was damaged in the last wind, and they've brought in more firewood, splitting and stacking it in the lean-to where it will stay dry and accessible. Your husband reports that the animals are all in good condition, that the cow's milk production is holding steady despite the cold, that the chickens are still laying though less prolifically than in warmer months. These small reports are the measure of your collective success, the signs that you're managing to keep not just yourselves but your entire fragile operation alive through another winter. As darkness falls completely you begin the evening ritual of preparation, moving through the cabin with practiced efficiency, arranging everything for the night ahead. The stones come out of the fire and go into their cloth wrappings, and you place them in the bed with careful precision, creating warm spots that will last for hours. You arrange the quilts, shaking them out and layering them properly, making sure there are no gaps where cold air could intrude. You check the chinking between the logs, pressing your hand against suspicious spots, feeling for drafts, stuffing additional material into any gaps you discover. Your husband banks the fire, layering it as you've learned together to do, and you fill the kettle with water and hang it where it will stay liquid but not boil away, ready for morning washing. You check on your son in the loft, climbing the ladder while he protests that he's fine, that he doesn't need you to fuss over him, but you go anyway and adjust his buffalo robe and make sure he has the knit cap you made him for sleeping in, the one that keeps his head warm and prevents heat from escaping through his scalp. And then, finally, you and your husband and your daughter settle into the bed, arranging yourselves in the nest of warmth you've created, feeling the heat from the stones, feeling the insulation of the quilts, feeling each other's warmth combining and multiplying. The cabin is as ready for night as you can make it, the fire banked and steady, the cold locked outside, the warmth locked in. Your daughter falls asleep quickly, as children do, her breathing becoming slow and deep, her small body relaxing completely into the warmth. Your husband follows soon after, exhausted from the day's physical labor, his arm draped across both of you, protective even in sleep. But you lie awake a while longer, listening to the night sounds, the fire's quiet conversation with itself, the wind testing the walls, the logs creaking in the cold. You lie awake and feel the warmth you've created, this small sphere of safety in a vast and indifferent landscape, and you feel the weight of responsibility that comes with it, the knowledge that this warmth is maintained through constant effort, that it requires vigilance and skill and an endless series of small correct decisions. But you also feel satisfaction, deep and uncomplicated, the satisfaction of having done well at something difficult, of having kept your children safe through another day and prepared them to survive another night. This is the work you've chosen, or the work that has chosen you. It's difficult to say which anymore, and you're learning to do it well, learning to read cold and fire and body heat, learning to arrange quilts and stones and walls and air into combinations that preserve life and comfort. Outside, the frontier night deepens, the temperature dropping toward the dangerous lows that come just before dawn, but inside your cabin, beneath your carefully layered quilts, beside your sleeping daughter and husband, you're warm enough, safe enough, alive and preparing to face tomorrow with the same careful attention you've brought to today. And this is enough. In this moment, in this carefully constructed warmth, this is enough. You stand at the threshold between autumn and the deep cold, and you feel the world contracting around you. The days have grown so brief now that you measure time not by hours but by the light that remains, the slant of sun through the cabin window, the speed with which warmth drains from the walls after sunset. November has turned the prairie into something unrecognizable, something harder and more honest than the land you crossed in summer. The children sense this shift without needing words. They move closer to you in the mornings, press their bodies against yours when you wake them, seeking heat before consciousness fully returns. The cabin feels smaller now, though nothing about its dimensions has changed. Perhaps it is the way you have begun to arrange your life around the stove, the way all activity orbits that single source of heat. The beds have been repositioned, dragged closer to the center of the room during a long afternoon when your husband and eldest son grunted and strained against the weight of the frames. The table sits nearer to the fire now. Even the trunk containing your most precious things, your mother's quilt and the letters from home, has been moved inward, away from the walls where frost will soon paint its nightly patterns on the chinked logs. You have begun to wake in darkness, hours before dawn, because the fire cannot sustain itself through the full length of these winter nights. Your body has learned to rouse itself when the temperature drops, some ancient instinct pulling you from sleep before the cold can settle too deeply into the room. You rise without lighting a candle, navigating by memory and the faint glow of embers in the stove. The floor is so cold it burns the soles of your feet, and you step quickly across the boards, wrapping a shawl around your shoulders as you move. Your husband stirs but does not wake. He will rise in an hour to begin the morning chores, but for now, this quiet duty is yours alone. The children sleep in the bed against the far wall, 3 small bodies tangled together beneath every blanket you own. You have arranged them by size, the way you learned from your mother, the way she learned from hers. The smallest child sleeps in the middle, flanked by the older ones, surrounded on all sides by warmth. Their faces are barely visible above the mounded covers, and you resist the urge to touch them, to check the temperature of their cheeks and foreheads. You have learned that waking them serves no purpose. Sleep itself is warmth. Sleep is the body's own conservation, a shutting down of all but the most essential functions. You open the stove door slowly, careful not to let the hinges creak. The embers inside glow a deep orange, pulsing slightly as fresh air reaches them. You add kindling first, small pieces of split pine that catch quickly, and then a larger log, one of the precious few that remain from the last cutting. The wood supply weighs on you constantly now, a calculation you perform multiple times each day. How much remains? How cold it might get? How long until spring? Your husband assures you there is enough, but you have learned to make your own accounting, to trust your own assessment of what will be needed. The fire builds slowly, and you stand close to it, absorbing heat while you wait for the cabin to warm enough that the children can rise without shock. This is your time, these dark hours before dawn when you are alone with the fire and your thoughts. You think about your mother often during these vigils, wondering if she stood like this in her own cabin, in her own darkness, feeding her own fire while her children slept. You wish you had asked her more questions before you left, wish you had understood that all the small tasks she performed without comment were in fact the essential architecture of survival. The light outside changes so gradually you almost miss it. The blackness at the window becomes charcoal, then slate, and finally the pale gray that means morning has arrived, though the sun itself remains hidden below the horizon. You move through the cabin now, performing the tasks that must be completed before the children wake. You bring in water from the bucket by the door, breaking through the thin skin of ice that has formed overnight. You slice bread from yesterday's loaf and set it near the stove to lose its chill. You warm the pot of beans that has sat cooling since last night's supper, adding a bit of salt pork for flavor and fat. The smallest child wakes first, as she almost always does. You hear her soft murmur before you see her, a questioning sound that is not quite language. You go to the bed and lift her out carefully, extracting her from the warm nest without disturbing her brothers. She is heavy with sleep, her body limp and trusting as you carry her to the rocking chair near the stove. You settle her in your lap, wrapping your shawl around both of you, and she burrows against your chest, still half dreaming. This is the moment you live for, these few minutes each morning when you hold your daughter close and feel her gradual return to wakefulness. Her breathing deepens and slows as the warmth reaches her, and she makes small sounds of contentment that pierce something deep in your chest. You rock slowly, the chair creaking its familiar rhythm against the floorboards, and you feel the weight of everything you carry, everything you must hold together through these winter months. The boys wake more reluctantly, their faces creased and irritable as they emerge from the covers. They have reached the age where they resist your comfort, preferring to establish their independence even in small things, but they still move automatically toward the stove, still seek the heat before anything else. You serve them breakfast in near silence, and they eat quickly, mechanically, fueling their bodies for the day ahead. Your husband returns from the barn with news that the animals are struggling with the cold. The milk cow's production has dropped, and one of the hens has stopped laying altogether. He speaks without alarm, simply reporting what he has observed, but you hear the concern beneath his words. The animals are your partners in survival, and their well-being is intertwined with your own. You make adjustments in your mind, recalculating what you will eat and what you will save, how you will stretch provisions that already seemed barely adequate. The morning unfolds in its necessary sequence. The children dress in layers, pulling on stockings and shirts and sweaters that you have knitted and reknitted, adjusting them as the children grow, unraveling old garments to create new ones. They wear their shoes inside now, something you never would have allowed in summer, but the cold makes its own rules. You braid your daughter's hair while she stands between your knees, and you feel the fragility of her skull beneath your fingers, the delicate architecture that you must protect. The day stretches ahead with its relentless demands. There is always washing to be done, even in winter, though you must heat water in quantities that consume what you can barely spare. There is mending and baking and the endless task of maintaining order in a space too small for all it must contain. The children underfoot, bored and restless, unable to play outside for more than brief intervals before the cold drives them back indoors. You manage their conflicts and their energy, redirecting and occupying them with whatever tasks they can reasonably perform. You teach your daughter to card wool, showing her how to pull the fibers between the wire teeth of the cards until they align and straighten. She is clumsy at first, frustrated by her own limitations, but you guide her hands with yours, helping her find the rhythm. This is how knowledge passes, you think. This is how we survive. Not through grand instruction but through these small demonstrations, repeated until they become instinct. The middle child, your eldest son, works alongside his father now, learning the management of livestock and equipment. You watch them through the window sometimes, seeing your husband's patience as he shows the boy how to properly care for the tools, how to split wood so the grain guides the maul, how to approach the animals with confidence and calm. The boy is thin still, not yet filled out into his full strength, but he moves with increasing competence, and you feel both pride and grief at his growing up. Your youngest son stays closer to you, still small enough to require constant supervision. He plays with simple toys, carved figures and cloth dolls, creating elaborate scenarios that he narrates in a steady murmur. You half listen as you work, tracking his voice to know he is safe and occupied. Sometimes he asks you questions that reveal how much he observes, how carefully he watches the world around him. Why does smoke rise? Where does the frost come from? Will spring ever come again? You answer as best you can, offering him what certainty you possess. Yes, spring will come. It always does. But even as you speak these words, you wonder if they are true, if anything can be guaranteed in this place where nature makes no promises. The afternoon brings a change in the weather that you feel before you see. The temperature drops noticeably, and the wind picks up, rattling the windows in their frames. Your husband comes inside earlier than usual, his face grave, and announces that a storm is coming, a real storm, not just the dustings of snow you have experienced so far. He has seen the signs, the color of the sky, the behavior of the animals, the way the air itself tastes of coming cold. You move into preparation without discussion. This is a dance you both know, steps learned from necessity and refined through repetition. He brings in as much wood as the cabin can hold, stacking it against the walls until there is barely room to move. You fill every vessel with water, knowing you may not be able to reach the well once the storm arrives. The children sense the urgency and grow quiet, watching you work with wide eyes. You prepare food in quantity, making a large pot of stew that can simmer on the stove for days if necessary, that can provide both sustenance and warmth. You bake bread and set it aside to cool. You boil eggs and wrap them in cloth. You are thinking ahead now, planning for the possibility that you will be trapped inside for longer than you expect. As darkness falls, the first snow begins. It comes not gently but horizontally, driven by wind that howls around the cabin's corners and finds every gap in the chinking. Your husband moves through the space, stuffing rags into the places where cold air seeps through, creating barriers against the coming night. You dress the children in extra layers, knowing they will sleep fully clothed tonight, knowing that every bit of fabric between their skin and the air might matter before this is over. You push the beds even closer together, creating a single large sleeping space that you will all share. There is no modesty in survival, no privacy that matters more than warmth. You will sleep as a family, bodies pressed close, breath mingling in the darkness, each person contributing their heat to the collective pool. The storm intensifies as night deepens, and the wind becomes a physical presence, a force that seems to shake the cabin's very foundations. Snow drives against the windows with a sound like thrown sand, and the temperature inside drops despite the roaring fire. You feed the stove constantly now, unable to let it cool even slightly. The woodpile that seemed so large just hours ago begins to diminish at an alarming rate. The children are frightened, though they try not to show it. Your daughter clings to your side, and the boys sit close to their father, seeking reassurance in his solid presence. You sing to them old songs from your childhood, hymns and ballads that your own mother sang. Your voice is not beautiful, but it is steady, and it gives them something to focus on besides the violence of the wind. You put them to bed before the fire has burned to coals, before the temperature has dropped too far. They protest, not tired enough for sleep, but you insist, knowing that the sooner they settle, the better chance they have of sleeping through the worst of the cold. You tuck them in with ruthless efficiency, layering blankets in a precise order, heaviest on top, creating weight as well as insulation. You place heated stones wrapped in cloth at their feet, at the small of their backs, knowing the warmth will seep away within hours but hoping it will carry them into deep enough sleep that they will not wake when it fades. Your youngest begins to cry, overwhelmed by the strangeness of the situation, the noise of the storm, the tension in your body that he can surely feel. You lie down beside him, curling your body around his, and you speak directly into his ear, words meant only for him. You tell him he is safe. You tell him you are here. You tell him the storm will pass and morning will come and everything will be all right. You do not know if these things are true, but you say them anyway, because this is what mothers do. We create certainty where none exists. We build walls of words against the chaos. Slowly, gradually, his crying subsides. His breathing deepens and steadies, and his body goes slack against yours. One by one, the other children follow him into sleep, their faces smoothing, their limbs relaxing. You remain still long after they have settled, reluctant to leave this nest of warmth, reluctant to return to the adult world of worry and calculation. But eventually you must rise. There is work to be done, vigilance to be maintained. You extract yourself carefully from the tangle of children and make your way back to the stove. Your husband sits in the rocking chair, watching the fire, and you can see the exhaustion in the set of his shoulders, the way his hands rest heavily on his knees. He has carried his own weight today, borne his own portion of fear. You sit on the floor beside his chair, leaning against his leg, and for a few minutes you simply rest together in silence. The storm continues to rage outside, but in this moment, inside this circle of firelight, you have created something that can withstand it. Not comfort, exactly, and not safety in any guaranteed sense, but a kind of temporary peace, a small victory against the elements. He speaks quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind. He tells you about the other families scattered across this territory, isolated in their own cabins, fighting their own battles against the cold. He wonders aloud who will survive this winter, who will make it through to spring. It is unlike him to voice such thoughts, and you understand that the storm has stripped away some of his usual stoicism, revealed the fear he carries beneath his capable exterior. You reach up and take his hand, lacing your fingers through his. You have no words of reassurance that would not sound hollow, so you offer only this physical connection, this reminder that whatever comes, you will face it together. The wind screams around the cabin, and the snow piles against the walls, and the darkness presses close, but your hand remains steady in his, and his grip does not falter. The night becomes a test of endurance. You and your husband take turns sleeping, one of you always awake to tend the fire, to listen for signs of danger, to monitor the children's breathing. The hours blur together, marked only by the addition of logs to the stove and the slow accumulation of snow outside. You exist in a kind of suspended state, not quite awake and not quite asleep, your body functioning on instinct and will. Somewhere in the deepest part of the night, you hear a sound that pulls you fully alert. It is not the wind or the snow or the creaking of the cabin. It is human, a voice, and it takes you a moment to locate its source. Your middle son is sitting up in bed, staring toward the window, and he is speaking in a low, urgent tone. You go to him quickly, kneeling beside the bed, and you realize he is still asleep, caught in some dream that the storm has infiltrated. You touch his shoulder gently, calling his name, trying to wake him without startling him. He resists at first, his body rigid, his eyes open but unseeing. Then something shifts, and he comes back to himself, focusing on your face in the dim light. He looks confused and frightened, and you gather him against you, rocking him the way you did when he was smaller, when such comfort was easier to give. He does not speak about his dream, and you do not ask. Some things are better left unexamined, better allowed to dissolve back into the darkness from which they came. You hold him until you feel his body relax, until his breathing deepens again, and then you ease him back down onto the mattress, pulling the covers up around his shoulders. His siblings have not stirred, so deeply are they sleeping, and you are grateful for this small mercy. The storm begins to abate in the hours before dawn, the wind gradually losing its fury, the snow falling more gently. You notice the change slowly, your exhausted mind slow to process the information. But eventually you understand that the worst has passed, that you have survived the night. The relief you feel is profound but quiet, a loosening of tension rather than any kind of triumph. You step outside briefly as gray light begins to filter across the prairie. The world has been transformed, buried beneath snow that reaches halfway up the cabin walls, drifted higher in places where the wind has sculpted it into fantastic shapes. The cold is absolute, deeper than anything you have felt before, and you can stay outside for only seconds before your lungs begin to burn and your face goes numb. Inside, you add wood to the fire and begin preparing breakfast, moving through familiar motions that ground you after the long night. Your husband wakes and dresses without speaking, and together you create the morning routine that will signal to the children that order has been restored, that the danger has passed. When they wake, they are amazed by the snow, pressing their faces to the window to see the transformed landscape. They beg to go outside, to play in this strange new world, but you shake your head firmly. Not yet. Not until the temperature rises. Not until you are certain it is safe. They accept your decision with surprisingly little protest, perhaps sensing how close to the edge you have come, how little you have left to give. The days following the storm are a study in patience. The snow is too deep for travel, the cold too severe for any but the most necessary outdoor work. You are trapped inside with 3 restless children and your own mounting anxiety about provisions, about wood, about all the things that could still go wrong before winter releases its grip. You develop new routines, new ways of managing the close quarters and limited resources. The children learn to play quietly, to settle conflicts without raising their voices, to read the signs of your patience wearing thin. Your daughter becomes your helper in earnest now, taking on small tasks without being asked, sensing what needs to be done. Your eldest son assumes more responsibility, becoming a bridge between childhood and adulthood, not quite one thing or the other but serving an essential role in the family's functioning. You teach them what you can during these confined days, knowing that education takes many forms. You tell them stories of their grandparents, of the places you came from, of the life that existed before this frontier existence. You teach them arithmetic using beans and string. You help them memorize poems and hymns, filling their minds with beauty even as the world outside remains harsh and unforgiving. Your husband carves toys and tools during the long evenings, his hands always occupied, always creating something useful or pleasant. He makes your daughter a small wooden doll with jointed limbs that move, and she treasures it like nothing she has ever owned. He repairs shoes and harnesses, he whittles pegs and handles, he maintains the equipment that you will need when the weather finally breaks. You sew and mend and knit, your needles moving in steady rhythm, creating warmth from wool and thread. Each stitch is a small act of defiance against the cold, each completed garment a victory. Your fingers grow sore and your eyes strain in the dim light, but you continue, because stopping would mean surrendering to despair. At night, after the children are asleep, you and your husband talk in low voices about spring, about planting, about the improvements you will make to the cabin and the land. These conversations are part planning and part prayer, a way of insisting that there will be a future beyond this endless winter. You speak of the garden you will plant, the crops you will try, the livestock you will acquire. You create a vision of abundance that sustains you through the scarcity of the present. Sometimes you allow yourself to think about the life you left behind, the comfort and security you knew before you made this journey west. You remember houses with multiple rooms, stores where you could purchase whatever you needed, communities where neighbors lived close enough to visit without risk. You remember warmth that did not require constant vigilance, safety that was not so hard-won. But these memories are dangerous, you have learned. They can weaken your resolve if you dwell on them too long. So you let them surface only briefly before turning your mind back to the present, to the tasks at hand, to the children sleeping nearby who depend on your strength and determination. The winter deepens, and more storms come, each one a trial to be endured. You lose track of dates, marking time only by the most basic cycles of darkness and light, sleeping and waking, hunger and eating. The world narrows to the space contained within the cabin walls, and you learn to find sufficiency in smallness, to make peace with limitation. Your body adapts in ways you could not have predicted. You learn to function on little sleep, to eat less than you need, to ignore cold that would have seemed unbearable months ago. You develop a kind of mental discipline, a way of pushing through discomfort and exhaustion that becomes second nature. You understand, in a way you never did before, what you are capable of when necessity demands it. The children grow thin, their faces losing the roundness of healthy childhood, their eyes large and serious. But they do not sicken, and for this you are grateful beyond measure. You watch them carefully for signs of illness, for the cough or fever that could spell disaster in these isolated conditions. But they remain strong, resilient in the way children are, their bodies somehow finding what they need even when it seems impossible. There are moments of grace scattered through these difficult weeks. A night when your youngest son laughs at something his brother has said, the sound bright and unexpected in the quiet cabin. An afternoon when your daughter masters a new skill, her face glowing with pride. A morning when you wake to find that your husband has already risen and built up the fire, allowing you to sleep a few minutes longer in the warmth he has created. These moments do not erase the hardship, but they make it bearable. They remind you why you endure, what you are protecting, what you are building through this suffering. They are small lights in a long darkness, and you gather them close, storing them against future need. You think often about the women who came before you, the generations who faced similar winters, similar trials. You feel connected to them across time and distance, part of a chain of endurance that stretches back further than you can imagine. They survived, and so will you. They kept their children warm and alive, and so will you. This knowledge becomes a kind of prayer, a mantra you repeat when doubt threatens to overwhelm you. And slowly, so slowly you almost do not notice at first, the days begin to lengthen. The light shifts subtly, lasting a few minutes longer each afternoon. The storms come less frequently. The temperature, while still bitterly cold, no longer drops to the life-threatening lows you have been experiencing. Spring is still far off, still more hope than reality, but the season has turned a corner, and you can feel it in your bones. You do not speak of this change, not wanting to tempt fate, but you see the knowledge in your husband's eyes, in the way he moves with slightly less urgency, slightly less desperation. You see it in the children too, some animal awareness that the worst has passed, that survival is no longer quite so uncertain. The cabin that has been your prison begins to feel like shelter again, like something you have built rather than something that constrains you. The stove that has demanded such constant attention becomes a center of warmth and life rather than an insatiable mouth consuming your resources. The bed where the children sleep tangled together becomes a symbol of the love that has sustained you, the bonds that have held you together through the darkest nights. You stand at the window one afternoon, watching the weak sunlight on the snow, and you allow yourself to believe that you will make it. That spring will come. That you will plant seeds in thawed ground and watch them grow. That these children pressed close around you will survive to become the next generation of pioneers, carrying forward the lessons you have taught them through this brutal winter. Your daughter comes to stand beside you, slipping her small hand into yours. She does not speak, but you feel her presence, her trust, her resilience. She has learned more this winter than any formal education could have taught her. She has learned that warmth must be created and maintained. That survival requires constant vigilance. That love is not a feeling but a series of actions, performed day after day, night after night, without pause or complaint. You squeeze her hand gently, and together you watch the light fade toward another evening, another night of cold to be survived. But the fire burns steady behind you, and your family is gathered close, and you have made it this far through sheer force of will and careful attention to the small tasks that sustain life. The rest of winter still stretches ahead, weeks more of cold and confinement, but the shape of it has changed. It is no longer infinite. It is no longer impossible. And tonight, when you put the children to bed, you will layer the blankets with the same care you have shown every night. You will place the heated stones with the same precision. You will tuck the covers tight around small shoulders and check that every gap is sealed against the cold. You will perform these small acts of love that have become your ritual, your prayer, your promise that morning will come again and you will all be here to see it. You stand at the window in the thin light of early morning, your hand still bearing the warmth of the quilt you have just tucked around your youngest child's shoulders. The sky outside is the color of pewter, that particular shade that arrives in the deepest part of winter when the sun seems reluctant to claim the horizon. You have lived through enough of these seasons now to recognize the quality of cold that settles into the land during these weeks, the kind that does not merely chill the skin but seems to reach down into the very bones of the earth itself. The cabin feels smaller in winter, not because its dimensions have changed but because the world beyond its walls has contracted, reduced to the few square miles you can safely traverse, the distance between your door and the nearest neighbor's homestead, the path to the root cellar you have dug into the hillside. Everything becomes closer, more immediate, more essential. Behind you, the children are beginning to stir. You hear the soft rustle of quilts, the creak of the ropes that support the mattress in the loft, the small sounds of waking that have become as familiar to you as your own breathing. Your daughter will be first, as she always is, slipping down the ladder with practiced silence, her bare feet seeking the warmth of the hearthstones even before her eyes are fully open. Your son will follow, slower, still wrapped in the fog of sleep that seems to cling to him longer each year as he grows. The youngest will need to be carried, though you suspect this winter may be the last when that is necessary. Already you have noticed how his legs have lengthened, how the trousers you made for him in autumn now hang above his ankles. Children grow so quickly here, or perhaps it is simply that you notice it more acutely when fabric is precious and the work of replacing outgrown clothes must be weighed against all the other demands on your time and resources. You move away from the window and return to the hearth, where the fire you built up during the night has burned down to a bed of coals that pulse with deep orange light. You kneel before it, feeling the stored heat rise toward your face, and begin the work of building it back into flame. The motions are automatic now, performed thousands of times over the years you have lived in this place. You position the kindling just so, creating channels for air to flow, encouraging the coals to remember their heat, coaxing them back into brightness. You have become intimate with fire in ways you never imagined in your former life, understanding its moods and needs, knowing when to add fuel and when to let it breathe, recognizing the difference between a fire that will sustain and one that will merely consume and die. The cabin warms slowly, degree by imperceptible degree. You stand and move to the table, where you have left the ingredients for breakfast prepared the night before. The cornmeal sits in a wooden bowl, already measured. The water you brought in yesterday afternoon rests in a bucket near the fire, no longer frozen but still cold enough to make your fingers ache when you dip them in. You pour some into a pot, hang it over the fire to heat, and begin the process of making the morning meal. Your hands work while your mind drifts, settling into that particular state of awareness that has become your default way of being, present to the task before you while simultaneously tracking a dozen other concerns, listening for changes in the children's breathing, monitoring the sound of the fire, noting the quality of light at the window that tells you how the weather is shifting. Your daughter appears at your elbow, materializing with the suddenness of someone who has learned to move quietly in a small space shared with many others. She is 10 now, or nearly so. You have noticed how the dates sometimes blur together out here, how the markers of time become less fixed when there are no newspapers arriving daily, no church bells dividing the hours, no calendars printed with holidays and observances. You mark time instead by the seasons of planting and harvest, by the births of animals, by the growth you measure in your children's bodies and the deepening of their competence. Your daughter has become indispensable to you in ways you could not have foreseen when you first arrived on this land. She knows without being told when to fetch water, when to add wood to the fire, when to check on her younger siblings. She has learned to card wool and spin thread, to churn butter and tend the garden, to recognize the signs of illness in the chickens and to understand when a storm is approaching by the quality of the wind. You hand her the bowl of eggs you collected yesterday evening, and she moves to crack them into the heating cornmeal, her movements efficient and assured. Together you work in companionable silence, preparing the food that will fuel the family through the morning's labor. Your son descends from the loft, rubbing his eyes, and you direct him to bring in more firewood from the covered pile just outside the door. He pulls on the coat you have sewn for him from 2 older coats combined and reinforced, wraps his feet in the wool socks you knitted during the previous winter, and steps out into the cold. The brief gust of frigid air that enters when the door opens reminds you of how much colder it is outside than in, how the work you have done through the night to maintain warmth has created this small pocket of survivable air within walls that are, when you think about it clearly, remarkably thin barriers against the vast indifference of the winter landscape. The youngest wakes last, calling for you from the loft in the half-crying voice of a child not yet fully roused. You climb the ladder, your body knowing each rung by instinct now, and gather him into your arms. He is warm from sleep, flushed and soft, and you hold him for a moment longer than necessary, feeling the weight of him, the reality of his existence, the fact that you have kept him alive through another night. This feeling never entirely leaves you, the awareness of fragility, the knowledge of how many things could go wrong, the understanding that survival here is not guaranteed but earned day by day, night by night, decision by careful decision. You carry him down the ladder, settle him on the bench near the fire, and wrap one of the quilts around his shoulders. He leans against the warm stones of the hearth, still half in dreams, and you return to the work of finishing breakfast. When the food is ready, you call the family together. Your husband comes in from the barn, where he has been tending to the animals since before dawn. His face is red from cold, his beard rimmed with frost that melts quickly in the cabin's warmth. He stamps his feet to restore circulation, hangs his coat on the peg by the door, and joins you at the table. The 6 of you, for there is also your husband's younger brother who lives with you, helping with the heavier work, gather around the wooden surface you have covered with a cloth made from flour sacks sewn together and bleached as white as you could manage. You bow your heads while your husband speaks a brief prayer of thanks, and then you eat. The meal is simple but substantial: cornmeal mush enriched with eggs and a small amount of the precious butter you have been hoarding, slices of bread from the loaves you baked 2 days ago, milk that is still warm from the morning milking. The children eat steadily, focused on their food with the concentration of those whose hunger is a daily companion, not a novelty. You eat more slowly, already thinking ahead to the tasks that will fill the hours between now and nightfall, already beginning the calculations that govern your days. How much firewood remains in the covered pile? Whether the snow will hold off long enough for you to make the trip to the creek for water? When you should check the supplies in the root cellar? Whether the chickens are producing enough eggs to justify the feed they consume? These considerations run beneath everything, a constant mental accompaniment to whatever else you are doing. After breakfast, the children scatter to their morning tasks. Your daughter begins clearing the table, scraping the plates clean and stacking them for washing. Your son returns to the woodpile to split more kindling, his small axe rising and falling with the rhythmic determination you have taught him. The youngest stays near you as you begin preparing the materials for the day's sewing work. You have promised to make a shirt for a neighbor's boy, and the fabric, purchased at considerable expense from the general store in town, waits folded on the shelf above your bed. You take it down now, spread it across the table, and begin the process of measuring and cutting, your scissors making soft decisive sounds as they travel through the cloth. Your husband and his brother prepare to go out to the far section of your land, where they have been clearing trees to expand the area available for next year's planting. It is hard work, made harder by the cold, but it cannot wait until spring. There are too many tasks that must be accomplished during the brief growing season, and any preparation that can be done in winter frees up precious time later. You help them pack food for their midday meal, wrapping bread and cheese in clean cloths, adding the last of the dried apples from autumn's harvest. Your husband touches your shoulder briefly before he leaves, a small gesture of connection, and then he and his brother step out into the cold, pulling the door shut behind them. The cabin feels immediately quieter, though not empty. The presence of children ensures that true silence is rare. You settle into your sewing, your daughter working beside you on the mending that never seems to end. There are always tears to repair, hems to let down, worn places to patch. She has become skilled with a needle, her stitches small and even, and you feel a particular kind of satisfaction watching her work. This is what you can give your children here: competence, the ability to do what is necessary, the knowledge of how to create and maintain and repair. These are the inheritances that matter on the frontier, more valuable than money or property, because they are the skills that enable survival. Your daughter will carry this knowledge forward into her own life, will teach it someday to her own children, and the line of women who know how to keep a family warm, fed, and clothed will extend forward into a future you can only imagine. As you sew, your mind returns to the question of warmth, to the specific challenge of keeping children safe through frontier nights. You have learned so much since you first arrived here, knowledge earned through trial and error and observation and the hard teacher of necessity. You think about Mrs. Harrington, whose cabin is 3 miles to the west, and how she lost a child to pneumonia 2 winters ago, how she has never quite recovered from that grief, how her face still carries the shadow of it. You think about the Jensen family, newcomers last spring, and how unprepared they were for their first winter, how the community came together to help them survive, bringing extra food and blankets and advice. You think about all the women you have known here, the various ways they have adapted to this life, the strategies each has developed for protecting the small vulnerable lives in their care. The morning passes in steady work. You finish cutting the pieces for the shirt and begin pinning them together, planning the order of your sewing. Your daughter completes the mending and moves on to carding wool, the rhythmic scritch-scritch of the cards a familiar sound that becomes part of the cabin's daily music. Your youngest plays near the hearth with the simple toys your husband has carved for him, a set of animals, roughly shaped but recognizable, that the child arranges and rearranges in endless scenarios. You glance at him periodically, checking that he has not moved too close to the fire, that he is warm enough, that his play remains peaceful. He is at that age where vigilance is still necessary but becoming less constant, where you can trust him for longer stretches without direct supervision. Around midday, you prepare a simple meal for yourself and the children. More bread, this time with a scraping of the wild plum jam you put up in summer, and milk to drink. You have learned to space the meals carefully, to make the food stretch across the day without allowing anyone to become so hungry that they cannot work effectively. It is another calculation, another balance to maintain. After eating, you send your daughter out to check on the chickens, to gather any eggs, to make sure their shelter has not been damaged by the wind that has been picking up through the morning. You can hear it now, a low constant presence, pressing against the cabin walls, finding the small gaps and cracks, whistling its cold song. Your son you send to the barn to help with whatever tasks your husband has left undone there, and to bring back more milk if any remains from the morning. Alone with your youngest, you take the opportunity to check his clothing, examining the seams of his shirt and trousers for wear, measuring his growing body against the garments he wears. He will need new clothes before spring, you realize, and you begin planning in your mind what you have available to work with, what you might trade for, what you can make from the materials already in your possession. There is a shirt of your husband's that has become too worn for regular use but still has good fabric in the body and sleeves. You could take it apart, cut it down, combine it with some of the cloth you have been saving, and make something suitable for a growing boy. The work will take time, but time in winter is more available than in any other season, and the sewing will keep your hands busy during the long evenings. Your daughter returns from the chicken coop with 3 eggs, a respectable number given the season. The hens slow their laying when the days grow short and cold, but you have learned techniques to encourage them, keeping their shelter as warm as possible, feeding them warm mash in the mornings, ensuring they have enough light. These small measures make a difference, and the eggs they produce are valuable both as food and as items for trade. You praise your daughter for her careful collection and send her to the root cellar to bring back potatoes and an onion for the evening meal. She pulls on her coat and wraps a shawl around her head before venturing out, and you watch through the window as she crosses the small distance to the cellar entrance, her figure bent against the wind. The afternoon light is already beginning to change, acquiring that particular quality that tells you evening is approaching even though it is still hours away. Winter days are short this far north, and you have learned to make peace with the darkness, to see the long nights not as enemies but as the season's natural rhythm. The darkness brings its own routines, its own textures. It is in the evenings that the family gathers most completely, that the work becomes quieter and more inward, that the stories are told and the songs are sung and the connections between you all are reinforced and strengthened. You think about the evening ahead, about the process of transitioning from day to night, about the rituals of warmth and safety that you will perform. You think about the moment when the last light fades from the windows and the cabin becomes its own contained universe, lit by firelight, warmed by your collective presence. You think about how you will prepare the children for sleep, how you will layer their protection against the cold, how you will check and recheck to ensure that they are safe. These thoughts are not anxious but preparatory, a mental rehearsal of the practices you have refined through years of experience. Your son returns from the barn, his face bright with cold and exertion. He reports that everything is secure, that the animals seem settled, that there is enough hay to last through the next several days. You thank him and direct him to bring in more water from the barrel outside, where you have been keeping it to prevent it from freezing solid. The barrel is positioned near enough to the cabin that some warmth leaks out to keep the water in liquid form, though it is cold enough that a skin of ice forms on the surface each night. He brings in 2 full buckets, sets them near the hearth where they will warm gradually, and then settles at the table with the reader you have been using to teach him his letters. He is slower to learn than your daughter was, but no less determined, and you have seen steady progress through the winter months. You return to your sewing, the needle moving in and out of the fabric in a rhythm as regular as breathing. Your daughter begins preparing vegetables for the evening meal, peeling potatoes with the small knife you have designated as hers, cutting them into pieces of uniform size. She works with the concentration of someone who takes pride in doing things well, and you feel a surge of affection for her, for the person she is becoming. She is reaching the age when she will begin to understand more fully the life that awaits her, when she will start making the transition from child to young woman. You know you need to begin teaching her the things she will need to know for that next phase, the knowledge about managing a household, about the cycles of women's bodies, about the particular challenges and strengths that will define her experience. These conversations will come, you think, perhaps beginning this winter, perhaps waiting until spring when the world opens up again and new possibilities seem more imaginable. The light continues to fade, and you rise to light the first lamp, touching a long splint to the fire and carrying the flame carefully to the wick. The lamp catches and blooms into steady light, adding its warm glow to the fire's illumination. You set it in the center of the table, where it will be most useful, and return to your sewing. The cabin takes on its evening character, becoming cozier, more intimate, as the darkness presses closer against the windows. You hear your husband and his brother returning, their voices carrying across the cold air before you hear their footsteps. They enter bringing cold with them, and the smell of pine sap and wood smoke and honest labor. They stamp their feet and remove their outdoor layers, warming their hands at the fire, reporting on the day's progress. Trees have been felled, cleared, cut into manageable lengths. It has been good productive work, and you can see the satisfaction in their faces despite their obvious fatigue. The evening routine begins in earnest now. Your husband tends to the animals one final time, making sure they have food and water sufficient to last through the night, checking their shelters for any problems that need addressing. His brother splits more wood, stacking it just inside the door where it will be accessible through the night without anyone having to venture outside. You and your daughter finish preparing the meal, and soon the cabin is filled with the smell of cooking food, potatoes fried in a little fat, bread rewarmed near the fire, a precious bit of salt pork to add flavor and substance. The family gathers once more around the table, and you serve the food onto the plates, the same plates you used this morning, washed and dried and ready for use again. Dinner is a longer meal than breakfast, less hurried, a time for the family to reconnect after the day's dispersal into individual tasks. Your husband tells stories of the work he and his brother accomplished, describing trees that fell in unexpected directions, a fox they spotted crossing the clearing, the quality of the wood they are harvesting. The children listen with attention, your son asking questions, your daughter offering observations. Even the youngest participates, though his contributions are simple and often tangential. You listen while you eat, adding your own comments occasionally, but mostly you watch and listen, taking in this moment of togetherness, storing it against the times of difficulty, building the bank of good memories that sustains you through challenges. After dinner, there is the work of cleaning up, of washing the dishes in water heated at the fire, of putting away the food that remains, of preparing the cabin for night. Your daughter helps you with this work, and together you restore order to the space. Your husband and his brother sit near the fire, your husband working on repairing a tool handle that cracked during the day's work, his brother oiling the leather harnesses that will be needed when the spring plowing begins. Your son practices his letters for a while longer, then puts away his reader and joins his father at the fire. The youngest grows increasingly drowsy, leaning against you when you sit down to rest for a moment, his eyes heavy, his body relaxed with the particular softness of a child ready for sleep. You recognize this moment as the beginning of the transition toward night, toward the time when your focus shifts entirely to the question of warmth, to the practice of keeping children safe through the hours of darkness. You rise and begin the preparations you have refined over your years here. First, you check the supply of firewood immediately at hand, making sure there is enough split kindling to last through the night, enough larger pieces to maintain a steady fire. You arrange it carefully, creating a system that will allow you to feed the fire efficiently during your periodic wakings. You place the larger pieces closest to the hearth, the kindling just behind them, everything positioned so you can reach it without having to fully wake, without having to light a lamp or disturb the sleeping family. Next, you turn your attention to the children's sleeping area in the loft. You climb the ladder, carrying a lamp, and examine the space in the light's steady glow. The mattress stuffed with straw and covered with ticking looks adequate, but you know how cold can seep up from below, how the floor of the loft, though warmer than the ground floor because heat rises, still requires insulation. You descend and gather the materials you will need, extra blankets that have been warming near the fire, the quilts you have been making and remaking and repairing throughout the winter, the wool socks and the flannel nightshirts you have prepared for the children. You carry these up to the loft, making several trips, and begin the process of preparing the sleeping space. You start with the base layer, spreading a heavy quilt directly over the mattress to create insulation from below. Over this goes the sheet, made from flour sacks bleached and sewn together, washed so many times it has become soft as cloth can be. You smooth it carefully, tucking it in at the corners, creating a clean sleeping surface. Then you build the layers that will cover the children, planning for their different needs and sizes. Your daughter is oldest and largest, and she will sleep on the outside edge where she can regulate her own temperature most easily, where she can add or remove blankets as needed through the night. Your son will sleep in the middle, benefiting from the warmth of his siblings on either side. The youngest will sleep closest to the chimney, where the residual heat from the fire below rises through the stone and provides additional warmth. You lay out their nightclothes, planning the process of getting them changed and settled. The youngest will need the most help, and you will change him first while your daughter assists the middle child. Then your daughter will change herself while you supervise, checking that everyone is properly dressed, that no skin is left unnecessarily exposed to the cold. Over their flannel nightshirts they will wear wool socks, and for the youngest, you have prepared a small wool cap that will keep his head warm through the night. These layers of clothing form the first barrier against cold, the foundation of your system of protection. You descend from the loft and call the children to prepare for bed. They come reluctantly, as children do, not quite ready to surrender the day even though their tiredness is evident. You warm water at the fire and wash their faces and hands, the small ritual of cleanliness that you maintain even in winter when water is precious and warmth hard-won. They change into their nightclothes near the fire, where the air is warmest, and you check each child carefully, looking for any signs of chill, any redness or chapping that needs addressing. You rub their hands and feet to ensure good circulation, and for the youngest, you apply a little of the rendered fat you keep for protecting skin against winter's harshness. When they are ready, you guide them up the ladder to the loft, helping the youngest, making sure each child is safely settled. You position them according to your plan, the youngest near the chimney, your son in the middle, your daughter on the outer edge. You begin the layering process, placing blankets over them one by one, tucking them carefully around small bodies, ensuring there are no gaps where cold air can penetrate. First goes a wool blanket that has served your family for years, worn thin in places but still serviceable. Over this you lay one of your quilts, the pattern a simple log cabin design in browns and blues, pieced together from scraps of worn clothing and fabric too damaged for other use. The stitching that holds the layers together is your own work, done during a previous winter, each stitch a small act of protection. Over the quilt you add another blanket, this one newer, traded for at the general store in town using butter and eggs you had managed to accumulate. It is heavier than the others, dense with warmth, and you smooth it carefully over the children, making sure it extends beyond the edges of the quilt beneath, creating overlapping layers of protection. Finally, you add one more quilt, your finest work, the one you have been creating over the past 2 winters from the best scraps you could save, its pattern more complex, its colors brighter. This quilt represents hours and hours of work, evenings spent stitching by firelight, days when you stole moments between other tasks to add a few more pieces. It is beautiful in its way, this quilt, and it is also eminently practical, thick and warm and well made. You tuck all these layers around the children, creating a cocoon of warmth that will see them through the night. You pay special attention to the edges, making sure the blankets and quilts extend under the mattress on the side where the youngest sleeps, creating a seal against the chimney wall. You ensure that your daughter's side is arranged so she can easily adjust the covers if she grows too warm or too cold, trusting her judgment and her awareness of her own body. You check that your son is not too tightly wrapped, that he has room to shift position if needed while still remaining covered. But the layering of blankets and quilts is not your only preparation. You have learned that maintaining warmth through the night requires multiple strategies, and you employ them all. Before tucking the children in completely, you have prepared heated stones, taking them from the fire where they have been warming, wrapping them carefully in thick pieces of flannel to prevent burns. You place one of these near the youngest's feet, another near your son's feet, creating sources of localized heat that will radiate warmth for hours. The stones are not large enough to be dangerous if a child should accidentally touch one through the flannel, but they are substantial enough to hold heat well into the night. This is a technique you learned from Mrs. Harrington, who learned it from her own mother, and you have found it invaluable. You also ensure that the children's heads are positioned away from any drafts. The loft is less susceptible to drafts than the ground floor, but you know that cold air can still find its way through gaps in the chinking between logs, through the small spaces around the roof beams. You have positioned the mattress during the summer, when you could see more clearly where the air moved, and you have stuffed rags into the worst gaps, but still you are careful to make sure the children's faces are not directly exposed to any moving air. When all is arranged to your satisfaction, you pause for a moment, looking at your 3 children tucked safely in their bed. They look small beneath the layers of covers, only their faces visible, and you feel the familiar swell of love and responsibility that has defined your life since you became a mother. Your daughter looks back at you with eyes that are already half closed, her face peaceful. Your son is already asleep, his breathing deep and even. The youngest reaches out a small hand toward you, and you take it, holding it gently until his eyes close and his grip relaxes. You whisper a blessing over them, words you have said so many times they have become almost automatic, but which still carry weight and meaning. You ask for their safety through the night, for warmth and rest, for health and strength. Then you descend the ladder quietly, leaving them to their sleep, knowing that your work through the night is just beginning. Downstairs, your husband and his brother are preparing their own sleeping space. They sleep on the ground floor, on pallets they spread near the fire each night. This arrangement serves multiple purposes. It keeps them warmer than they would be in the loft, it allows them to tend the fire through the night without disturbing the children, and it provides an additional layer of security, their bodies between the door and the sleeping children above. You have your own pallet that you spread between theirs and the fire, positioning yourself where you can most easily rise to tend the flames, where you can hear if any of the children call out in the night. Before lying down, you complete the final preparations for night. You check the door to ensure it is securely latched, that the leather hinges are sound, that the fit is tight enough to exclude the worst of the drafts. You check the windows, such as they are, small openings covered with oiled paper that admit some light during the day but provides minimal insulation. You have hung blankets over them for the winter, creating an additional barrier, and you adjust these now, making sure they are securely fastened. You check the fire one more time, building it up with larger pieces of wood that will burn slowly through the early hours of night, creating a foundation of coals that will be easy to revive when you wake later. You lay out the clothes you will need if you must rise in the night, positioning them where you can find them by feel in the darkness. Your shawl, your heaviest stockings, the slippers you have made from scraps of wool felt. You check that the fire tools are within easy reach, that the supply of kindling is exactly where you expect it to be. These preparations are the result of years of experience, small refinements you have made each winter, learning from difficulties, building a system that allows you to maintain the fire with minimal disruption to your own rest. Finally, you lie down on your own pallet, pulling your blankets around you. The cabin settles into its nighttime sounds, the crackle of the fire, the whisper of wind outside, the steady breathing of your family. Your husband reaches across the small space between your pallets and finds your hand, squeezes it gently. This small gesture of connection, repeated each night, says more than words could about your partnership in survival, your shared commitment to keeping your family safe and warm. You squeeze back, then release his hand and close your eyes, allowing yourself to rest but not to sleep deeply, training yourself to remain aware even in sleep, ready to wake when needed. The night unfolds in the pattern you have come to know so well. You wake periodically, automatically, your body having learned the rhythm of fire tending. The first time you wake, perhaps 2 hours after lying down, you rise silently in the darkness, wrapping your shawl around your shoulders. The fire has burned down but not out, the coals still glowing with deep heat. You add kindling carefully, watching as it catches and flames into brightness. You add slightly larger pieces, building the fire back to a level that will sustain through the next period of sleep. You listen for the children above you, hearing nothing but peaceful breathing. You check that no drafts have developed, that the cabin remains as sealed as you can make it. Then you return to your pallet and sleep again. The second waking comes in the deepest part of night, when the cold outside has reached its nadir and presses most insistently against your walls. You tend the fire again, this time adding larger pieces that will burn longer. You consider going up to check on the children but decide against it, trusting in the preparations you have made, not wanting to risk waking them by climbing the ladder. Instead, you stand at the base of the ladder and listen intently, separating out the sounds of their breathing, counting them, assuring yourself that all three are sleeping peacefully. Satisfied, you return to the fire, warm yourself for a few moments, then lie down again. The third waking comes near dawn, when the darkness is just beginning to thin at the edges. You rise and tend the fire, building it higher now, beginning the transition from night fire to day fire. You add water to the pot that hangs at the edge of the hearth, preparing for the morning's cooking. You move quietly around the cabin, beginning the day's work while the rest of the family still sleeps. This time before dawn is yours alone, a small space of solitude in a life that allows very little privacy. You use it to think, to plan, to simply exist without the immediate needs of others pressing upon you. When the light at the windows becomes definite enough to call it morning, you hear the first stirrings from the loft. Your daughter, as always, is first to wake. You hear the rustle of covers being pushed back, the soft sound of her feet on the loft floor. She appears at the top of the ladder, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face soft with sleep. She descends and comes to stand near the fire, warming herself, and you hand her a cup of water that has been heating at the edge of the hearth. She drinks it slowly, and you see her fully wake, her eyes sharpening, her posture straightening. Together you wake the boys, calling up to them gently, coaxing them from the warmth of their bed. They descend more reluctantly than your daughter, but they come, and you check them over as you did the night before, looking for any signs that your preparations were insufficient, that the night cold managed to reach them despite your efforts. But they are fine, healthy and whole, their cheeks pink with warmth, their eyes bright. You have kept them safe through another night, and the satisfaction you feel is profound, though you do not name it or dwell upon it. There is simply the fact of their well-being, and the knowledge that you will do it all again tonight, and every night through the winter, until the season turns and warmth returns to the land. The morning proceeds much as the previous one did, the routines repeating because they work, because they are the structure that holds your life together. But today, as you move through the familiar tasks, you find yourself thinking more consciously about the patterns you have established, about the knowledge you have accumulated, about what it means to be a woman keeping children warm on frontier nights. You think about how much you have learned, how much you have had to learn, how the person you were when you first came to this place would hardly recognize the person you have become. You remember your first winter here, how frightened you were, how uncertain. You remember the night when you could not get the fire to burn properly, when smoke filled the cabin and you had to open the door and windows despite the cold, how you sat wrapped in blankets with your infant daughter crying in your arms, wondering if you had made a terrible mistake in coming to this place. You remember the morning when you woke to find frost on the inside of the cabin walls, how inadequate your preparations had been, how much you had to learn about insulation and draft prevention and the proper management of fire. But you also remember the neighbors who came to help you, the women who taught you what they knew, who shared their techniques and their hard-won wisdom. You remember Mrs. Harrington arriving with extra blankets and showing you how to layer them properly. You remember Mrs. Jensen, who despite being older and more experienced still wanted to hear about the different ways you had learned to do things, who understood that there were always new techniques to be discovered, better methods to be developed. You remember the community of women, scattered across miles of frontier, connected by their shared determination to keep their families alive and safe, united by the common challenge of survival in a place that offered beauty and possibility but also hardship and constant vigilance. As the morning progresses and you return to your sewing, you think about how you will pass this knowledge forward to your own daughter, how you are already passing it forward, teaching her through participation, through observation, through the gradual transfer of responsibility. She is learning to read the weather, to judge how much firewood will be needed, to recognize when a child is truly cold versus simply complaining, to understand the difference between discomfort and danger. These lessons are not taught in formal sessions but absorbed gradually, day by day, through the living of this life. Your daughter is becoming competent in the same way you became competent, through necessity and practice and the patient accumulation of skill. You think too about the larger patterns, about how this knowledge moves through time, about the long line of women who have faced similar challenges in different times and places. You think about your own grandmother, who lived in a different country and faced different specific challenges but who must have done her own version of what you do now, tending fire, layering blankets, checking on sleeping children, carrying the weight of responsibility for their survival. You think about how this work of keeping children warm and safe is women's work, not because men are incapable of it but because it has traditionally fallen to women, because the bearing of children has always drawn women into the work of sustaining them, because the connection between mother and child creates a particular kind of vigilance that never entirely sleeps. But you also know that this work is not yours alone, that your husband and his brother contribute in their own ways, that survival here requires the labor of all. Your husband's work clearing land and building structures and repairing tools creates the foundation that makes your work possible. His brother's help with the heavy tasks frees you to focus on the more detailed work of daily maintenance. And your children, even young as they are, contribute their labor, their growing competence, their willingness to learn and help. The survival of your family is a collective effort, with each person playing their part, and you recognize this even as you acknowledge the particular nature of your own role. The day continues, and you complete the shirt you have been sewing, fold it carefully, and set it aside for delivery to your neighbor. You begin work on cutting down your husband's old shirt to make new clothes for your youngest, spreading the worn fabric on the table, considering how best to use the good material that remains. Your hands move with automatic skill, but your mind continues to wander through the landscape of memory and reflection, thinking about warmth and safety, about the many ways you have learned to protect your children, about the knowledge that resides not in books or formal instruction but in the bodies and minds of women who live it daily. You think about the specific techniques you have developed or adopted over the years. The way you position the children in relation to the chimney and to each other. The strategic placement of heated stones. The careful layering of blankets and quilts, each layer serving a specific purpose. The attention to drafts and the sealing of gaps. The maintenance of fire through the night, the rhythm of waking and tending and returning to sleep. The preparation of warm food for evening meal that raises body temperature before sleep. The dressing of children in layers of clothing that trap air and create insulation. The way you have learned to judge when conditions are cold enough to require extra measures versus when your standard preparations will suffice. But beyond the specific techniques, you think about the larger wisdom you have developed, the understanding of cold itself and how it moves and where it concentrates and how it can be countered. You have become intimate with temperature in ways that would seem strange to someone who had not lived this life, able to sense small variations in warmth, able to predict how the night cold will behave based on the quality of the day's weather, able to feel drafts that others might not notice. This knowledge is embodied, held in your senses as much as in your conscious mind, and it guides your actions often without your fully realizing it. You have also developed a particular kind of vigilance, an ability to monitor your children's well-being even while asleep, to wake at the slightest sound that seems wrong, to sense when something needs attention before it becomes urgent. This vigilance is exhausting in its way, never allowing you to fully rest, always keeping part of your awareness engaged. But it has also become so habitual that you barely notice it, as natural as breathing, simply part of who you are. You cannot imagine sleeping through a whole night without waking to check on things, without tending the fire, without listening for your children. Your body will not allow it, trained by years of necessity to maintain this watch. As afternoon turns toward evening and you begin preparing the second day's evening meal, you reflect on the fact that this winter is already more than half over. The days are beginning, almost imperceptibly, to lengthen. Spring is still months away, and there will be more cold nights, more snow, more periods of harsh weather. But the trajectory is set now, moving toward warmth, toward the season when your life will shift from this intense focus on maintenance and survival toward the explosive activity of planting and growth. You can begin to imagine the spring nights when you will no longer need to layer quite so many blankets, when the fire can be allowed to burn lower, when the doors can sometimes be left open to catch the breeze. But that time is not yet here, and you return your focus to the present, to the work of getting through this night and the next and the one after that. The evening routine unfolds again, dinner and cleanup and the careful preparation of the sleeping space. You check your supplies, noting what is running low, planning what you will need to acquire before winter ends. Firewood is still adequate but will need replenishing within the next few weeks. Food supplies are holding but declining. You will need to be careful with portions, will need to resist the temptation to be too generous even when the children seem particularly hungry. Lamp oil is getting low, and you will need to make a trip to town soon, weather permitting, to purchase more. These practical concerns ground you, give you specific problems to solve rather than abstract worries to dwell on. You find comfort in the concreteness of these challenges, in the fact that they have solutions, that you have the knowledge and resources to address them. This is the way you have learned to manage the larger anxieties of frontier life, by breaking them down into manageable pieces, by focusing on what you can control, by trusting in the systems you have built and the knowledge you have accumulated. As darkness falls again and the children are once more tucked safely in the loft, as you lie down on your pallet between the fire and your sleeping family, you feel a sense of continuity, of being part of something larger than yourself. You are one woman, in one cabin, on one piece of frontier land, but you are also part of a vast network of women doing similar work, facing similar challenges, drawing on similar reserves of strength and determination. The techniques you use were developed by other women and passed to you, and you will pass them forward to your daughter, who will perhaps adapt them further and pass them to her own daughters. This knowledge, this competence, this determination to keep children warm and safe through frontier nights, this is your inheritance and your legacy. It is not recorded in books or celebrated in public forums. It is not the kind of achievement that earns recognition or reward. But it is essential, fundamental, the bedrock upon which families are built and communities sustained. Without this work, without the daily unglamorous labor of tending fire and layering blankets and waking in the night to ensure that all is well, none of the more visible achievements of frontier life would be possible. You close your eyes, allowing yourself to rest, knowing you will wake in a few hours to tend the fire, knowing this pattern will repeat through the night and into tomorrow and for all the remaining nights of winter. You accept this rhythm, embrace it even, because it is the price of keeping your children safe, and there is no price you would not pay for that. The fire crackles softly, the cabin holds its warmth, and above you in the loft, 3 children sleep peacefully, protected by your knowledge, your vigilance, your love. This is enough. This is everything. You stand at the window of your cabin now, watching the pale light of a winter dawn spread across snow that has already begun to soften at its edges, and you know that this night, like all the others before it, has passed into memory, into the long chain of winter survived and mornings welcomed. The children are still asleep behind you, tucked beneath their quilts and buffalo robes, their breathing steady and deep, and you allow yourself this moment of stillness before the day calls you back into motion, back into the 100 tasks that will carry you from sunrise to dusk and beyond. The fire in the hearth has burned low but not out. You built it carefully enough last night that it would last until morning, and now you move to it quietly, adding kindling first, then larger pieces of split wood, coaxing the flames back to life with the same patience you have learned to apply to everything in this life. The wood catches, crackles softly, and warmth begins to radiate outward once more, reclaiming the spaces where cold had crept in during the darkest hours. You think of your own mother standing at a hearth like this one, performing these same motions, and her mother before her, and you realize that you are not alone in this work, that you never have been, that every time you tend a fire or wrap a child against the cold, you are part of something older and larger than yourself, a tradition of care that stretches back through generations and forward into futures you will never see. The sky outside shifts from deep blue to pale gray, then to a soft wash of pink along the horizon, and you watch this transformation with the quiet attention of someone who has learned to mark time by such changes, to read the day's intentions in the quality of its light. There is something peaceful in this hour before the household wakes, something that feels almost sacred, and you let yourself sink into it, let the silence wrap around you like one of the quilts you have stitched and stuffed and bound with your own hands. You think of the women you have known, neighbors, relatives, friends made and lost over years of migration and settlement, and you carry them with you in moments like this, carry their voices and their wisdom and the small kindnesses they offered when you needed them most. Sarah's voice comes back to you now, soft and steady as it was on that afternoon when she showed you how to properly bank a fire for the night, how to arrange the coals so they would hold heat without consuming too much wood, and you remember the way her hands moved with such certainty, such practiced grace, as though fire were a language she had spoken all her life. She told you that her grandmother had taught her, and her grandmother's mother before that, a chain of knowledge passed hand to hand, woman to woman, through decades and across distances that might have broken other connections. You use her method still, every night, and each time you do, you feel her presence beside you, a quiet companionship that transcends the miles and years that now separate you. You think too of the women who did not survive their first winters, the ones whose graves mark the trails westward like punctuation in a long and difficult sentence. You never knew most of them, only heard their stories secondhand, a woman who froze to death when her wagon broke down in a blizzard, another who lost 3 children to pneumonia in a single terrible week, a young mother who simply gave up after too many losses, too much cold, too much isolation pressing down on her spirit until it could bear no more. Their absences haunt you in a way that is not frightening but sobering, a reminder of how close the edge always is, how much depends on luck and preparation and the strength you can muster when everything inside you wants to surrender. But you did not surrender, and neither did the women around you, and that shared resilience has created something here, something fragile but real, a community of sorts, scattered across these prairie miles but connected by the understanding that comes from facing the same hardships, the same fears, the same long nights when the cold presses in and the children cry and every match, every ember, every scrap of wool feels like the only thing standing between survival and catastrophe. You have learned to ask for help when you need it, and to offer it without waiting to be asked, and in this simple exchange you have found something that sustains you as surely as food or warmth or shelter, a sense that you are part of something, that your life and your work matter beyond the narrow confines of your own cabin and your own family. The light continues to grow, and with it comes the first stirring from the loft, a soft rustling of blankets, a child's sleepy murmur, and you turn from the window to begin the morning routines that will shape the hours ahead. You move quietly so as not to wake the others too soon, setting the kettle on its hook above the fire, pulling out the bread you baked yesterday and the butter wrapped in cheesecloth, preparing the simple meal that will start the day. There is comfort in these motions, in the way your hands know what to do without needing to be told, in the familiar rhythm of morning tasks performed 1,000 times before and certain to be performed 1,000 times again. Emma is the first to climb down from the loft, still wrapped in her quilt, her hair tangled from sleep, and she comes to stand beside you at the hearth, drawn by the warmth and the promise of breakfast. You pull her close, wrapping your arm around her shoulders, and she leans into you with the easy trust of a child who has always been warm, always been fed, always been held when she needed holding. You know that she does not fully understand yet what it has cost to give her this security, what it continues to cost each day, but you do not need her to understand. It is enough that she is here, that she is safe, that the cold did not take her as it has taken so many others. Thomas follows a few minutes later, and then the younger ones, until the cabin fills with the soft sounds of morning, voices still rough with sleep, the scrape of benches being pulled to the table, the quiet laughter that comes when someone fumbles or makes a small joke. You serve the bread and butter, pour cups of warm milk heated over the fire, and watch as your children eat, their faces glowing in the firelight, their bodies relaxed and easy in a way that tells you they slept well, that the cold did not reach them, that your work through the night was enough. Your husband joins you at the table, his movements slow and careful after a night that was likely no more restful for him than it was for you, and you exchange a look that carries in it all the unspoken understanding of partners who have weathered hard seasons together, who have learned to rely on each other without needing to put that reliance into words. He reaches across the table to touch your hand, a brief gesture that grounds you both, and then you turn your attention back to the children, to the morning, to the day that is beginning to take shape around you. After breakfast, you send the older children to their chores, wood to be brought in, water to be hauled from the well, animals to be fed and tended, and you begin your own work, the endless cycle of cooking and cleaning and mending that fills your days and keeps the household running. But even as you work, your mind drifts back to the night that has just passed, to the vigilance required to keep children warm in the dark hours, and you think about what this vigilance has taught you, what it has made of you over these years on the frontier. It has made you stronger, certainly, in ways both physical and mental. You can lift heavier loads now than you ever could before, can work longer hours, can push through exhaustion that would once have felled you. But it has also made you more tender, more attuned to the small vulnerabilities of the people you love, more aware of how quickly warmth can slip away, how easily a life can be lost if you turn your attention away for even a moment. You have learned to hold both of these truths at once, the strength and the tenderness, the resilience and the fragility, and in learning to hold them, you have become someone you might not recognize if you could meet the younger version of yourself, the woman who set out westward with so many hopes and so little understanding of what those hopes would require. You think of the women who will come after you, the daughters and granddaughters who will inherit this land and this life, and you wonder what they will make of your struggles, your choices, your small victories over cold and darkness. Will they understand what it meant to keep children warm with so little, to make blankets from rags and fill mattresses with dried grass, to wake every few hours through the night to tend a fire that could mean the difference between life and death? Or will they have moved beyond such hardships into a world where warmth comes easily, where cold is an inconvenience rather than a threat, where the work you have done becomes a quaint historical curiosity rather than a lived and urgent reality? You cannot know, of course, and perhaps it does not matter. Your work is for the present, for the children who sleep under your roof tonight, and if that work allows for easier futures, for warmer homes and safer winters, then that is legacy enough. But you hope, in some quiet corner of your heart, that the women who come after will carry forward not just the comfort you have won for them but also the knowledge of how that comfort was won, the understanding that warmth is not a given but a gift, hard-earned and carefully maintained, and that the capacity to create and sustain that warmth is something worth honoring, worth remembering, worth passing down through the generations. The morning deepens, and you move through your tasks with the steady rhythm that has become second nature, your hands busy with work while your mind continues to wander through memory and reflection. You think of the first winter you spent in this cabin, how terrified you were, how unprepared despite all the advice and warnings you had received, and you remember the night when Emma, just a baby then, developed a cough that seemed to tear through her small body, and you held her close to the fire, wrapped in every blanket you owned, praying to a God you were not always certain was listening that she would make it through until morning. She did make it through, and so did you, and in the days that followed you began to learn, really learn, not just in theory but in the deep muscle memory of your body and the sharpened instincts of your mind, how to read the signs of cold, how to anticipate its movements, how to build defenses that would hold against its siege. You learned which corners of the cabin lost heat fastest, which hours of the night required the most vigilance, which children ran colder than others and needed extra layers, extra attention. You learned to trust your own judgment even when it contradicted what you had been told, to adapt the old methods to new circumstances, to innovate when necessity demanded it. And you learned, perhaps most importantly, that you were capable of more than you had believed, that you could endure longer, work harder, sacrifice more than you had ever imagined possible, and that this capacity for endurance was not unique to you but was shared by the women all around you, each of them fighting their own battles against cold and isolation and the thousand small cruelties of frontier life. You learned that strength was not always loud or dramatic but was often quiet and persistent, showing up day after day to do the necessary work, to tend the necessary fires, to wrap the necessary children in whatever warmth could be found or made or stolen from a landscape that offered so little freely. The sun is fully risen now, casting long shadows across the snow, and you step outside for a moment to feel the air on your face, to gauge the temperature and the wind and the general disposition of the day. It is cold still, but not dangerously so, the kind of cold that stings your cheeks and makes your breath visible, but that can be managed with the right clothing, the right preparations. You know that there will be harder days ahead, that winter is far from over, but for now the immediate crisis has passed, and you allow yourself to feel a small measure of relief, a small space of ease in the midst of constant vigilance. You think of the quilt you have been working on during the long evenings, the one you started last autumn and have been adding to piece by piece whenever you can steal a few minutes from the relentless press of daily tasks. It is made from scraps, bits of worn clothing, remnants of fabric too small for anything else, the odd pieces left over from other projects, but you have arranged these scraps with care, creating patterns that please your eye, combinations of color and texture that transform the ordinary into something almost beautiful. You work on this quilt not because your family needs another one, though they could certainly use it, but because the act of making it soothes something in you, gives you a sense of purpose beyond mere survival, connects you to the long tradition of women who have made beauty out of necessity and found meaning in the work of their hands. Each piece of fabric carries its own memory, a square cut from Thomas's first shirt, another from Emma's baby dress, a strip of calico that once lined your mother's sewing basket, and as you stitch these pieces together you are also stitching together the story of your life, the small moments and large changes that have brought you to this place, this morning, this particular configuration of joy and sorrow and hard-won wisdom. The quilt will outlast you, you know that. It will warm children and grandchildren you will never meet, will be folded and unfolded by hands that do not know your name, will carry forward into the future some small piece of your care, your attention, your love made tangible in cotton and thread. Inside the cabin, the children are beginning to play, their voices rising in games and small disputes and bursts of laughter, and the sound fills you with a contentment that is all the sweeter for being so hard-won, so precarious, so utterly dependent on your continued vigilance and effort. You know that this contentment will not last, that new challenges will arise, that winter will test you again and again before it finally releases its grip and allows spring to return, but for now you let yourself rest in this moment, let yourself feel the warmth of the fire and the presence of your family and the simple satisfaction of having made it through another night. You think of the stories you will tell someday, when these children are grown and have children of their own, stories about the winters on the frontier and the ways you learned to survive them. You wonder if they will believe you, if they will be able to imagine a life so different from whatever lives they will lead in that distant future, or if your struggles will seem as remote and unreal to them as the struggles of ancient peoples sometimes seem to you now. But whether they believe or not, you will tell the stories, because the stories are all you have to give them beyond the physical warmth and safety you provide in their childhood. The stories are the inheritance that will remain when the quilts wear out and the cabin falls to ruin and your own bones return to the prairie soil. The day unfolds slowly, each hour bringing its own tasks and small events, and you move through them with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to make the most of every moment, to waste nothing, not time, not energy, not heat, not the precious daylight that will begin to fade all too soon. You bake bread for tomorrow, you mend a tear in Thomas's trousers, you work on the quilt for a few stolen minutes while the younger children nap, you prepare the evening meal, and through it all you are also preparing for the night to come, for the next round of fire tending and blanket checking and vigilant watching that will begin again as soon as darkness falls. But there is something different in your preparation today, some subtle shift in your relationship to the work. You are no less committed to it, no less aware of its importance, but you feel less alone in it somehow, more connected to the long chain of women who have done this work before you and who will do it after you are gone. You feel their presence like a warmth at your back, a steady support that helps you carry the weight of responsibility that might otherwise crush you, and you are grateful for this invisible company, this sense of being part of something larger than your own small life and struggles. As afternoon slides toward evening, you begin to gather the children close again, to check their clothing and their shoes, to make sure that everyone has eaten enough and drunk enough and used the privy before the cold of night makes such trips more difficult. You build up the fire, you heat the stones that will warm the beds, you fill the warming pans and wrap them carefully, and you do all of this with the calm assurance of someone who has performed these actions hundreds of times and knows their value, knows that these small careful preparations are what stand between your children and the cold that waits just beyond the cabin walls. Your husband helps with the heavier tasks, splitting more wood, banking the coals just so, checking the seals around the door and windows, and together you create a fortress of warmth, a small protected space where life can continue, where children can sleep and dream and wake to another day. There is something deeply satisfying in this partnership, in the way your separate labors weave together into a single protective tapestry, and you feel a rush of affection for this man who has chosen to build this life with you, who has stayed beside you through seasons that might have broken a lesser commitment. Night falls, and with it comes the familiar ritual of bedtime, children herded to the loft, prayers spoken in soft voices, blankets tucked and retucked until everyone is settled and warm. You climb the ladder one last time to kiss each small forehead, to whisper goodnight, to reassure yourself that they are all breathing easily, all comfortable, all safe for now. And then you descend back to the main room, back to the fire and the long watch that will carry you through to morning. But tonight you do not feel the weight of that watch as heavily as you sometimes do. Tonight you feel instead a kind of peace, a sense that you are exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you are meant to do, and that this work, however humble and unglamorous it may appear, is work of profound importance, work that shapes not just the present moment but the future that will grow from it. You think of the children sleeping above you, warm and safe because of your efforts, and you know that whatever else you accomplish in your life, whatever else you fail at or struggle with or never quite manage to achieve, this at least you have done. You have kept them warm, you have kept them alive, you have given them the gift of another day. The fire burns steady in the hearth, and you settle into your chair beside it, pulling your own quilt around your shoulders, preparing for the hours of wakefulness ahead. Your husband sits across from you, working on a piece of harness that needs mending, and for a while neither of you speaks, content simply to be together in the warm circle of firelight, to share this quiet companionship that has deepened and strengthened over the years of your marriage. Eventually he will go to bed, trusting you to keep watch, and you will sit here alone with your thoughts and your memories and the soft sounds of your family sleeping, and you will tend the fire and check on the children and do all the small necessary things that have become so familiar they feel less like work and more like meditation, like a form of prayer offered not with words but with actions, with the steady giving of yourself in service to the people you love. You think back over the long arc of this winter, over all the nights you have sat just like this, watching and waiting and tending, and you realize that something has shifted in you, something subtle but significant. You are no longer the frightened young woman who came west with more hope than preparation, no longer the overwhelmed mother who panicked at every cough and fever, no longer someone who doubts her capacity to meet the challenges that frontier life presents. You have become, through repetition and necessity and the gradual accumulation of small victories, someone who knows how to survive, someone who can be trusted with the lives of others, someone whose strength runs deep enough to draw on when the surface reserves are exhausted. This knowledge does not make you proud exactly. Pride seems too simple a word for what you feel, but it does give you a kind of quiet confidence, a sense that you have earned your place in this landscape, that you belong here not because the land has welcomed you but because you have refused to let it drive you away, because you have learned its rhythms and adapted to its demands and found ways to create warmth and life in a place that seems designed to extinguish both. The night deepens around you, and you rise to add more wood to the fire, to check the temperature of the stones in the beds above, to walk through the cabin touching walls and windows to feel for drafts that might need attention. Everything is as it should be. The children sleep soundly, the fire burns steady, the cold is held at bay for another night. You return to your chair and pick up your sewing, working by firelight on the quilt that has become your companion through these long watches, and with each stitch you feel yourself connected not just to the future that will use this quilt but also to the past that taught you how to make it, to all the women who have sat in similar chairs on similar nights, doing similar work, keeping similar watch over the people they love. You think of your own mother again, and this time the memory comes without the sharp edge of grief that once accompanied it, softened now by time and distance and the understanding that comes from having walked in her footsteps, from having learned firsthand the weight and the worth of the work she did. You wish you could tell her that you understand now, that you see her differently than you did as a child, that you recognize the love that manifested in all those small acts of care, the meals prepared, the clothes mended, the fires tended, the children warmed and fed and watched over through long nights. You wish you could thank her, not just for the things she gave you but for the example she set, for the quiet strength she modeled, for the way she showed you, without ever putting it into words, that love is not always grand gestures and dramatic sacrifices but is more often the simple daily choice to show up, to do the work, to keep going when everything in you wants to stop. The hours pass slowly, measured by the burning of logs and the gradual movement of shadows across the floor, and you let yourself drift in and out of reverie, your hands busy with their work while your mind wanders through memory and meditation. You think about the community of women you have found here, scattered though it is across the vast distances of the prairie, and you feel grateful for their presence in your life, for the knowledge they have shared and the support they have offered and the simple fact of knowing that you are not alone in this struggle, that others understand what you face because they face it too. You think of Sarah, who taught you to bank a fire, and of Margaret, who showed you how to make a warming box from stones and wool, and of Elizabeth, who sat with you through a terrible night when Emma was sick and you thought you might lose her, and of all the other women whose names and faces and small acts of kindness have helped carry you through these years. You wonder if they know how much they have meant to you, if they understand that their small offerings of help and wisdom have made the difference between survival and surrender, and you resolve to tell them when you see them next, to let them know that their lives and their work have mattered, have made an imprint that will last beyond the immediacy of these hard seasons. The fire burns low and you build it up again, and in this rhythm, the burning down and the building up, the constant attention required to maintain warmth in the face of persistent cold, you find a metaphor for everything you have learned about life on the frontier, about motherhood, about love and resilience and the thousand small ways that people care for each other when the world offers no easy comforts. You understand now that warmth is not something that simply exists but something that must be constantly created and recreated, that it requires vigilance and effort and the willingness to sacrifice your own rest and comfort for the sake of others, and that this work, though it may never be celebrated or even fully seen, is perhaps the most important work there is. Dawn begins its slow approach, the darkness outside softening by barely perceptible degrees, and you feel the familiar mixture of relief and exhaustion that comes with having made it through another night. Soon the children will wake, and the day's work will begin again, and you will move through it with the same steady determination that has carried you this far and will carry you further still. But for now, in this quiet space between night and morning, you allow yourself to simply sit and be, to feel the warmth of the fire and the weight of the quilt across your shoulders and the deep satisfaction of knowing that you have done what needed to be done, that you have kept your children warm through another frontier night. You close your eyes for just a moment, not sleeping but resting, and in that darkness behind your eyelids you see faces, your mother's face, your grandmother's, the faces of women you have known and women you have only heard stories about, all of them connected by this same work, this same love, this same fierce commitment to protecting the vulnerable and creating warmth in cold places. You are part of this lineage now, fully and completely, and though the work is hard and the nights are long and the cold is relentless, you would not trade it away, would not choose an easier path if one were offered, because this work has made you who you are, has revealed to you depths of strength and tenderness you did not know you possessed, has connected you to something ancient and enduring and profoundly meaningful. The first light of dawn touches the window, pale and tentative, and you open your eyes to meet it, ready for whatever this new day will bring, ready to begin again the endless cycle of tending and caring and watching over the lives that have been entrusted to you. The fire still burns in the hearth, the children still sleep in their beds above, and you sit here in the quiet center of it all, the keeper of warmth, the guardian of these small fragile lives, and you know with a certainty that goes deeper than thought or language that this is enough, that this is everything, that in keeping these children warm you are participating in something holy and essential and worth every sacrifice it requires. You rise from your chair, your body stiff from the long night of sitting, and you move to the window to watch the sun rise over the snow-covered prairie, over this landscape that has tested you and shaped you and made you into someone you are still learning to recognize and respect. The sky shifts from gray to gold, and the light spills across the frozen earth, illuminating the small cabin that holds everything you love, everything that matters, and you stand there watching as this new day is born, as warmth returns to the world, as the long night finally releases its hold and allows morning to enter. Behind you, you hear the first stirrings from the loft, a child's voice calling for you, and you turn from the window to answer that call, to begin again the work that never truly ends but only pauses, only rests for brief moments between one night and the next. You climb the ladder to the loft, to the tousled heads and sleepy eyes of your children, and you gather them close, feeling their warmth against you, feeling the steady beat of their hearts and the rise and fall of their breath, and you are filled with a gratitude so profound it brings tears to your eyes, gratitude that they are here, that they are alive, that you have been given another day to love them and care for them and keep them safe from all the cold dark things that wait beyond these walls. This is the work of pioneer women, you think, not just the physical labor of hauling water and chopping wood and stitching quilts, but this deeper work of love and vigilance, this commitment to creating and maintaining warmth in all its forms, this willingness to stand between the cold and the vulnerable and say, quietly but firmly, not here, not these children, not tonight. And this work continues, you know, long after the frontier has faded into history, long after the specific challenges of sod houses and buffalo robes have been replaced by other challenges, other struggles. The essential task remains the same, to keep children warm, to keep them safe, to give them the shelter and care they need to grow and thrive and eventually take up this work themselves, passing it forward to the next generation and the next, an unbroken chain of love and protection that stretches from the deep past into the unknowable future. You help the children dress, you guide them down from the loft, you serve them breakfast and comb their hair and listen to their chatter about dreams and plans and all the small important things that fill the world of childhood. And as you move through these morning rituals, you carry with you the knowledge of the night that has just passed, the long hours of watching and tending and keeping vigil, and you know that tonight you will do it all again, and the night after that, and the night after that, for as long as these children need you, for as long as your strength holds, for as long as there is warmth to be made and cold to be kept at bay. The sun rises higher, flooding the cabin with light and warmth, and you step outside for a moment to feel it on your face, to let it remind you that spring will come eventually, that winter does not last forever, that hard seasons give way to easier ones, and the work you do now will make those easier seasons possible. But even as you think of spring, you know that you will not abandon this vigilance, this attention to the small necessary acts that keep people safe and warm and loved. You will carry it with you into all the seasons of your life, into all the years that remain to you, because it has become part of who you are, woven into the very fabric of your being as surely as the scraps of fabric are woven into the quilts you make. You go back inside, back to your family and your work and the endless beautiful demanding rhythm of days on the frontier, and you do so with a full heart and a clear sense of purpose, knowing that what you do matters, that it will be remembered not in history books or monuments but in the lives of the children you warm and protect, in the stories they will tell and the care they will pass forward, in the long inheritance of warmth that flows through generations like a river, sometimes visible, and sometimes hidden but always moving, always carrying forward the love and labor of women who stood watch through long cold nights and refused to let the darkness win.